Meanwhile, the emotional psychology of commerce transformed. Before the riots, trade often symbolized social rivalry. Afterward, it symbolized unity. Markets became places where strangers exchanged more than goods. They exchanged stories, memories, and visions of future identity. Despite these successes, Constantinople stood vulnerable to outside forces. The empire's borders stretched across thousands of miles. Persia remained a powerful rival. Germanic kingdoms in the west challenged Justinian's dream of Roman reunification. Internal reconstruction did not erase external threats. Yet the economic revival allowed Justinian to finance future military campaigns. The wealth generated after the fire later funded wars in Africa and Italy, forging his reputation as the emperor who briefly restored Roman dominion over the Mediterranean. In summary, the economic transformation following the Great Fire was as significant as the architectural rebirth. Wealth returned to the city not by luck, but by design. Justinian transformed destruction into opportunity, turning Constantinople into a powerhouse of trade, design, and law. The empire had risen from ash into brilliance, and the history of this remarkable period continued to unfold with greater challenges, political intrigues, and cultural triumphs. As Reconstruction progressed steadily, a new political atmosphere emerged in Constantinople, one shaped by silence, caution, and subtle power realignment. The Nika Riots had killed thousands, destroyed buildings, and reshaped urban space. But they also eradicated old political balances. The Senate's authority, once respected and feared, had dissolved. Many senators were either dead, disgraced, or stripped of influence. Those who survived behaved cautiously, terrified that a single misstep could call imperial suspicion upon them. Justinian understood exactly what advantage this gave him. Even family members addressed him formally. He trusted only few people: Theodora, certain generals like Belisarius, and a handful of scholars. Everyone else remained at emotional distance. Yet this isolation served political benefit. Justinian avoided faction manipulation and aristocratic gossip. Because he trusted so few, conspiracies found little entry. But psychological cost remained. Evidence suggests Justinian sometimes worried whether people loved him or feared him. He likely questioned whether loyalty came from respect, obligation, or terror. Such doubts haunt rulers more than enemies do. Spiritually, Justinian intensified devotion to religion in his later years. After witnessing both fire and rebuilding miracle, he believed his reign belonged to divine timeline rather than human timeline. He prayed constantly, fasted regularly, consulted priests for guidance, and attended services inside Hagia Sophia not for display, but for personal meaning. Interestingly, Justinian never saw the rebuilt city as a finished project. To him, every success represented foundation for next improvement. He extended church-building programs across empire. He ordered law revisions even after original codification. He restructured military supply chains repeatedly. His relentless drive reflected ambition bordering on exhaustion. His introspective writings reveal he believed God chose him to restore glory of Rome. This belief provided strength, but it also produced near-fatal pride. He viewed disagreement not merely as political resistance, but as moral rebellion against divine order. This worldview would later complicate interactions with lawmakers, bishops, and generals. Thus, Justinian evolved from reformist ruler into symbolic emperor, a figure who embodied both Rome's ancient legacy and divine Christian mission. The Great Fire did not break him. It remade him into a leader shaped by ash, faith, responsibility, pride, insecurity, and relentless vision. To understand post-fire Constantinople, one must examine emotional leadership. Justinian's rule offers fascinating psychological study. How trauma-informed governance differs from leadership shaped only by ambition or war. Emperor and citizens experienced shared trauma. This shaped reciprocal expectations. People saw Emperor as protector who saved them from chaos. Justinian saw people as fragile beings in need of strong guidance. This mutual emotional projection changed empire dramatically. Before the fire, Justinian sought traditional respect, legal reputation, conquest fame, dynastic legitimacy. After the riots, he chased immortality through spiritual achievement. Hagia Sophia, legal codification, reconquest. These became attempts to rewrite human memory. He wanted future generations not only to admire him, but to understand he fought darkness and reshaped world. Emotionally charged public speeches reveal this desire. Justinian spoke of empire rising from ashes like phoenix. He described citizens as chosen people living in chosen city. Fire survivors embraced these words, not because they blindly believed emperor, but because they needed narrative explaining trauma. It is easier to survive suffering when it becomes story of destiny rather than accident. This emotional leadership strengthened empire unity but suppressed dissent. Citizens questioning government risked being accused of breaking sacred story. Complaining about taxes meant complaining about divine mission. Disagreeing with policies meant resisting destiny. Many openly supported imperial ideology, not only from loyalty, but from fear of betraying narrative that gave them purpose. Theodora influenced emotional narrative just as strongly. She presented empire not as monument of law, but as community of souls. She convinced Justinian to fund welfare, hospitals, orphanages, and women's shelters. These institutions helped rebuild emotional trust between state and people. Carthage and surrounding territories contributed agricultural resources, tax revenue, and military prestige. Grain shipments increased, improving Constantinople's food supply and reducing economic anxiety. Justinian celebrated the African victory with enormous public ceremonies. He needed these victories to prove that the riots had not crippled imperial power. The people of Constantinople, still rebuilding homes, watched triumphal parades featuring captured Vandal prisoners, spoils of war, and banners symbolizing reconquest. These parades resembled ancient Roman celebrations, intentionally linking Justinian to emperors like Trajan and Augustus. Citizens cheered, not only because they admired victory, but because triumph offered psychological relief from memories of fire and civic collapse. However, imperial success abroad introduced new problems at home. With victory came arrogance among military leaders. Belisarius returned as a hero, earning public admiration that rivaled the emperor's own. Justinian, protective of his authority, walked a careful line between rewarding and restraining his general. Suspicion and jealousy hovered between them, even while partnership continued. The city whispered rumors. Was Belisarius too powerful? Would he challenge the emperor someday? Could a military hero threaten imperial bloodline? Justinian did not allow such questions to grow. He controlled public narratives tightly through imperial propaganda. Monuments, coins, and official speeches emphasized that Belisarius succeeded only through Justinian's wisdom. Even the African victory was framed as divine favor for the emperor, not individual military skill. Meanwhile, internal memory of the fire influenced all political interpretation. Citizens who lived through the riots measured new events against their trauma. They saw reconquest as proof that pain produced strength, that ashes produced empire. Widows, orphans, and disaster survivors felt empire did not abandon them. But emotional leadership also created fragility. Citizens idealized Justinian so intensely that any mistake risked shattering faith. Empire expected perfection from him. Spiritual perfection, legal perfection, moral perfection. No human could ever meet such expectations fully. Yet Justinian tried, pushing himself to exhaustion. He also faced emotional tension between public triumph and private grief. His imperial image radiated control, yet inside courtrooms he dealt with betrayal, rumor, and administrative chaos daily. Fire survivors projected stability onto him. He carried burden of appearing invulnerable, although fatigue weighed heavily. Historians often overlooked psychological dynamics shaping empire law. Justinian's strictness reflected trauma response. After riots, he feared disorder above all things. He believed compassion without structure produced chaos. Meanwhile, Theodora's compassionate laws reflected her own trauma-informed empathy shaped by childhood poverty. Together, their personalities fused into empire identity. Citizens also developed trauma-shaped behaviors. They valued safety, structure, and predictability. They feared street conflict, remembering desperation of riot days. They supported urban policing because they wanted peace at any cost. This emotional climate allowed Justinian to centralize authority more easily than previous rulers could. Yet not all emotional consequences remained positive. Fire survivors sometimes overreacted to minor danger. When occasional street fights erupted, people panicked, fearing riots had returned. When earthquakes shook ground, families believed prophecy coming true. Trauma lived dormant in their minds, waiting to be triggered by noise, smell, or memory. It became a civic myth. Constantinople had burned, but the empire had risen stronger, ready to conquer foreign lands. Thus, the African War cannot be separated from the Great Fire's aftermath. Success abroad strengthened morale at home, funded reconstruction, and reshaped Justinian's confidence. It also deepened the ideological belief that Constantinople was a sacred capital, chosen by destiny to lead a renewed Roman world. This belief would fuel further ambition and further conflict. After North Africa, Justinian's attention turned to Italy, birthplace of Roman imperial culture. Since the collapse of the Western Empire decades earlier, Italy had remained under the rule of the Ostrogoths. Their kingdom possessed strong leadership and stable infrastructure, but Justinian viewed them as illegitimate occupiers of Rome, the spiritual ancestor of Constantinople. Many Byzantine officials believed that reclaiming Rome would symbolize restoration of imperial identity. Initially, Justinian intended to begin his Italian campaign earlier, but the Nika Riots delayed plans by at least a year. Had the fire not occurred, the empire might have invaded Italy sooner. But destruction forced Justinian to pause, rebuild, and reorganize. In this way, the Great Fire shaped global political events, redirecting the timeline of European power. The Italian campaign officially began in 535 CE, led once again by Belisarius. His troops traveled across Sicily, then moved northward. The Ostrogoths, led by King Theodahad and later King Witigis, resisted fiercely. The war dragged on far longer than the African campaign. Italy's geography, politics, and cultural attachments complicated the conflict. Whereas Africa fell quickly, Italy became a lengthy struggle defined by sieges, alliances, betrayals, and famine. The siege of Rome in 537 to 538 revealed how deeply the West still mattered to imperial imagination. Belisarius and his soldiers defended the city against overwhelming Ostrogothic forces. Citizens starved, disease spread, corpses lined gutters. Yet Belisarius refused surrender. His success defending Rome became legendary. securing his place as one of the most brilliant commanders of his age. Back in Constantinople, news from Italy arrived slowly and often inaccurately. Citizens gathered in public squares, reading letters from relatives serving in the army. Some panicked, believing the war would drain the empire. Others praised God for every recorded victory. Justinian used the war news to keep morale high. He staged public prayers inside the partially completed Hagia Sophia, linking imperial ambition to divine purpose. Theodora played indirect roles in the Italian campaign too. While Justinian focused on strategy, she advised him to show mercy to Roman civilians and avoid repeating the brutality seen in the Hippodrome slaughter. She believed that victory must feel liberating, not oppressive. Her advice highlighted a subtle conflict between the emperor and empress. Justinian prioritized political structure, while Theodora emphasized human impact. Economically, the Italian War both benefited and burdened Constantinople. Trade with Italy reopened gradually, increasing access to luxury goods, manuscripts, and artwork. Yet the war also drained treasury funds, forcing Justinian to adjust tax policy. While construction continued, its pace slowed slightly, especially for secondary building projects. Resources were split between war demands and urban development. Still, the empire remained stable enough to pursue both agendas. Hagia Sophia grew steadily toward completion. More marble glistened under sunlight. New mosaics adorned interior chambers. As Rome struggled with siege warfare, Constantinople worked on creating a masterpiece of architecture and faith. These contrasting realities shaped empire identity. Constantinople represented heavenly order, while Italy represented earthly conflict. But political triumph could not erase domestic tension. Some citizens asked why Constantinople, still scarred from fire, was funding war abroad instead of restoring poorer neighborhoods faster. Justinian responded by presenting war as a continuation of renewal. He argued that rebuilding Rome meant rebuilding the empire's soul. Many believed him. For those who suffered under the Nika Riots, national purpose eased personal grief. They interpreted victory as evidence that suffering had meaning. Thus, war abroad and reconstruction at home existed not separately, but as part of one imperial ideology. Fire taught survival. Survival taught ambition. Ambition created expansion. The Great Fire was now remembered not only as tragedy, but as catalyst. Without the fire, Justinian might never have reshaped the empire into a world force. Without tragedy, glory might not have emerged. Despite grand military victories and architectural achievements, Justinian's empire faced growing geopolitical strain. Persia remained a powerful rival in the east. Although Justinian signed treaties with the Sasanian Shah Khosrow I, peace was temporary. Both empires recognized that future conflict was inevitable. Persia observed Constantinople's reconstruction with a mixture of awe and fear. The Persians knew that a fully rebuilt Roman capital would possess the economic strength to fund massive armies. Thus, they watched and waited. Persian ambassadors visited the city, reporting every stone laid, every warship built, and every law passed. They studied the Hippodrome massacre, the fire, and the rebuilding movement. To Persia, the Nika riots were a sign of Roman internal weakness, but the response to them, especially the construction of Hagia Sophia, proved Roman resilience. Justinian, aware of Persian surveillance, used rebuild efforts as psychological warfare. He ordered public ceremonies emphasizing imperial strength. When Hagia Sophia's dome neared completion, foreign delegations were invited to witness interior mosaics. Some ambassadors returned home stunned by what they saw, describing Constantinople as a living miracle. Diplomacy played subtle roles too. Justinian wanted stability in the east while expanding in the west. So he offered Persia enormous payments to delay war. Critics later accused him of wasting money, but his strategy protected the rebuilding timeline. If Persia attacked during reconstruction, the empire may have collapsed. Justinian purchased time while Hagia Sophia and city infrastructure reached completion. Meanwhile, within Constantinople, demographics continued shifting. The arrival of foreign builders, merchants, and war refugees diversified the city further. Markets bustled with Egyptian spices, African ivory, Italian pottery, Armenian textiles, and Slavic woodcraft. A cultural explosion occurred at street level. Languages blended, accents evolved, and neighborhood diversity increased. Social tensions rose alongside this diversity. Some citizens resented immigrant workers earning good wages. Fears circulated that jobs would disappear once Hagia Sophia finished. Government advisors recommended investing in long-term industries so the economy would not collapse once reconstruction ended. Justinian responded by funding shipyards, textile mills, ironworks, and glass workshops. He planned a permanent economy anchored in trade, one not dependent solely on construction. New social classes formed from these changes. Skilled laborers became respected members of society, challenging aristocratic dominance. Craftsmen who built the Hagia Sophia earned fame, pride, and economic security. Their descendants would later form guilds central to Byzantine trade. Even spiritual life changed. With Hagia Sophia rising higher each month, citizens felt its presence transform the emotional atmosphere. The unfinished dome cast shadows across nearby streets, reminding people daily that they lived in a sacred city. Priests held services at the building site, praying over scaffolding and blessing workers. Yet, psychological scars from the riots lingered. In songs, stories, and public conversations, people still spoke about the flames that once swallowed the city. They remembered the night sky turning red, the ash falling like snow, the roar of collapsing roofs, the screams echoing beneath smoke. They remembered the Hippodrome, where 30,000 people died. Some elders worried that the empire moved too fast. They feared new wars, new fires, and new uprisings. Others believed change was destiny. Constantinople had become a city defined by extremes. Peace and conquest, faith and fear, devastation and renewal. Still, Justinian pressed forward. His dream remained unfinished. Conquering Italy completely, reaching Spain, stabilizing Persia, and turning Constantinople into the wonder of the world. The Great Fire had destroyed thousands of homes, but it had ignited something else. A new vision of empire that reshaped history, architecture, religion, law, and war. The completion of Hagia Sophia stands as one of the most remarkable achievements in architectural history, not only because of its engineering brilliance, but because of what it symbolized, the climax of Justinian's recovery plan after the Great Fire. For years had passed since the flames ravaged Constantinople, and yet, in place of ruins, there now rose a cathedral so immense and luminous that contemporaries believed it represented heaven made visible on earth. For most citizens, Hagia Sophia was more than a building. It was a living monument to survival, faith, and imperial dominance. When the cathedral opened its doors in 537 CE, crowds flooded the plaza in anticipation. They gazed upward at the enormous dome floating above the city, held aloft by mathematical design that seemed almost supernatural. No structure in the world had ever achieved such scale. The dome's presence changed the skyline permanently. Constantinople, once known for walls, harbors, and palaces, now became a city crowned by a miracle of engineering. Its golden roof caught sunlight and reflected it into surrounding districts. Sailors returning from journeys could see its shimmering dome miles away on the water. The city appeared reborn, not merely repaired. Inside Hagia Sophia, the experience was even more overwhelming. Mosaics covered walls with glittering images of Christ, saints, angels, and imperial emblems. Gold tesserae captured candlelight and transformed the interior glow into radiant halos. Marble panels, sourced from dozens of regions throughout the empire, created stunning patterns. Deep green, purple porphyry, pale bluestone, cream veined slabs, and speckled varieties polished to a mirror-like shine. Clergy walked across smooth floors that had once been rubble and ash. The sound of chanting echoed within the dome and returned as rich embroidery of layered harmonics, a resonance no cathedral had ever produced before. Engineers who had designed the structure wept inside, because sound behaved exactly as they dreamed. Justinian himself entered Hagia Sophia with triumphant emotion. Historians recorded that upon viewing the completed dome, he exclaimed, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." Whether those words were truly spoken or later embellished, the statement captured the emperor's ambition. He wanted Constantinople to outshine Jerusalem and Rome, to stand as the spiritual capital of the Christian world. The cathedral was not built merely to honor God, but to honor God through imperial partnership. It proclaimed that Justinian ruled with divine blessing, that his empire had risen greater from destruction, and that spiritual authority now rested within the Eastern Roman realm, not the ruins of Western Rome. For the people who had lived through the Great Fire, Hagia Sophia brought emotional closure. It proved that death and devastation could not destroy the essence of Constantinople. Survivors gathered beneath the dome and whispered prayers, tracing memories of lost relatives, burned homes, and months of hunger. They looked upward at the soaring vault and interpreted it as evidence of hope that surpassed grief. The building itself became a psychological shelter, absorbing fear and replacing it with awe. Religious leadership embraced the cathedral as physical manifestation of doctrine. Patriarch Menace, serving as chief bishop during Justinian's later reign, used Hagia Sophia to centralize ecclesiastical authority. Sermons delivered inside emphasized unity against heresy. Orthodoxy gained new platform strength, and the cathedral's grandeur discouraged dissent. Political rebels and theological outliers found it far more difficult to challenge Justinian's authority with such a magnificent visual symbol reinforcing imperial truth. Foreign visitors, whether allies or rivals, felt intimidated. Ambassadors from Persia, Africa, and the Western kingdoms described Hagia Sophia as a structure beyond human creation. Their accounts circulated abroad, increasing Constantinople's prestige. Diplomatic negotiations shifted subtly because foreign rulers now confronted an empire whose capital appeared God-touched. Even hostile powers feared that divine favor rested with Justinian. Yet, Hagia Sophia was not merely spiritual, it was socioeconomic. The construction consumed thousands of workers for years. When the project finished, that entire labor population required reassignment. Justinian anticipated this and had already begun developing new industries that could absorb displaced workers. Without careful planning, completion might have led to unemployment and unrest. But with textile mills, shipyards, and market expansion already underway, workers transitioned smoothly. Even so, Hagia Sophia did not solve every problem. Some aristocrats resented its colossal cost. They whispered that Justinian spent too much on marble and mosaics, while ordinary neighborhoods still needed rebuilding. Others believed Justinian had grown too proud, risking divine judgment. Religious critics argued that faith should be expressed through humility, not monumental architecture. But their voices were few. The cathedral silenced most opposition simply through awe. Thus, Hagia Sophia served as cornerstone for a new imperial identity. It was triumph against flame, riot, rebellion, and despair. A symbol that Justinian transformed chaos into world-defining beauty. But this achievement marked not an ending, but a turning point. The empire would soon face deeper political challenges, testing whether glory could withstand corruption, war, plague, and time. The completion of Hagia Sophia reshaped Constantinople socially and psychologically. Before its construction, the city healed through shared trauma. Afterwards, it healed through shared pride. Public festivals commemorated not just survival, but rebirth. During major feast days, massive crowds gathered in the square outside the cathedral. Priests burned incense that drifted skyward like prayer smoke, mingling with bells that rang throughout the capital. The air pulsed with spiritual energy and civic patriotism. People from every district, fishermen, aristocrats, merchants, scholars, soldiers, widows, migrant laborers, craftsmen, and foreign travelers, stood together under the open sky. Their voices intertwined, chanting psalms as the sun set behind a shimmering dome. These events rebuilt Constantinople's social fabric, replacing the faction rivalry between blues and greens with a new cultural identity rooted in Christian unity. Instead of cheering chariots, crowds now praised the divine architecture binding them together. The hippodrome roar that once threatened imperial collapse faded into a relic of another era. Justinian carefully controlled the circus factions, limiting their political authority and preventing gatherings from turning into protest movements. Chariot racing existed under strict supervision, transforming entertainment rather than dictating politics. This shift had profound consequences. For centuries, Constantinople lived with a dual power structure: imperial government and faction influence. After the fire, that dynamic ended. Now, the cathedral and palace formed the symbolic heart of the city. People no longer looked to faction leaders for identity. They looked to religious ritual, imperial speeches, and communal celebrations. The political atmosphere became more centralized and hierarchical. Education also evolved under Hagia Sophia's influence. Scholars interpreted architecture as poetic theology, using mathematical designs to teach students about divine order. Classrooms filled with young minds studying geometry, scripture, philosophy, law, astronomy, and medical science. Many students came from families who once served in construction crews. Education became a pathway for upward mobility. Meanwhile, women, empowered under Theodora's influence, began participating more visibly in literary circles and charity roles. Some hosted discussion salons, inviting theologians and philosophers to debate ethics, scripture, and empire. Although Byzantine society remained patriarchal, the intellectual awakening gave women greater cultural presence than they held before the fire. Yet beneath this bright cultural surface, social tension persisted. Many survivors still carried physical reminders of trauma: burned scars, lung damage from smoke, broken limbs from collapsing roofs. Some developed permanent breathing disorders from dust inhalation during rebuilding work. Medical clinics operated throughout the districts, treating long-term effects of the disaster. Physicians recorded cases of stress-induced illnesses, insomnia, anxiety tremors, memory loss, and panic attacks triggered by loud noises resembling riot echoes. Economically, the new identity depended on continuous productivity. Justinian pushed trade markets forward aggressively. Street vendors sold religious souvenirs near Hagia Sophia. Artists painted icons of the Virgin Mary and filled stalls with scripture manuscripts. Booksellers copied theological works from monks and scholars. Tourism flourished. Believers arrived from distant regions to pray inside the cathedral. The spiritual economy of Constantinople rivaled its commercial one. But this economic success risked dependency on religious traffic. Some advisors warned Justinian that political identity could not rely solely on spiritual magnificence. They encouraged continued investment in infrastructure, roads, ports, bridges, and defense systems. Justinian agreed. New warehouses lined the Golden Horn, increasing storage capacity for grain and supplies. Expanded shipyards constructed war vessels and merchant fleets. Aqueduct repairs improved water distribution, preventing disease. Still, not everyone benefited equally. Poverty lingered in outer districts. Some neighborhoods rebuilt with plain stone instead of luxurious marble. A divide formed between inner ring residents, closer to the palace, and those living on city edges. This division, though subtle at first, would later grow into significant socioeconomic distance. Some developed superstition. They wore amulets made from melted coins collected from burned ruins. They placed ash in small cloth bags, believing it protected families. These traditions reflected grief and hope merging. Children born after the fire carried different emotional identity. They knew city primarily through stories rather than memory. Their pride reflected growth rather than survival. They felt curiosity, not fear, toward ruins. Their emotional worldview lacked trauma scars, but gained ambition. Thus, post-fire leadership created cultural duality. City divided between trauma memory and hope identity. Elders feared losing caution. Youth feared living under shadow of past forever. This psychological richness shaped governance. Justinian struggled to balance old trauma generation, demanding stability, and young generation demanding opportunity. If one group controlled empire entirely, imbalance could trigger political instability. Therefore, emotional leadership became delicate art, combining fear with hope, discipline with inspiration, memory with progress. As Justinian adapted emotionally, empire pressures intensified physically. The enormous task of ruling stretched him beyond human limits. Court records indicate he slept very little, often working through nights reading reports or writing legal instructions. This exhaustion manifested not only in mind but in body. Wax tablets from physicians reveal occasional references to headaches, stomach disorders, and fluctuating appetite. These observations may seem trivial, but they expose reality. Leadership erodes physical health. Beyond personal strain, Justinian wrestled with moral burden of death. He authorized executions after riot. He ordered armies in a war knowing thousands would fall. He constructed monuments built by workers who sometimes died under heavy stone. Although Justinian believed his reign reflected divine will, he could not entirely ignore ethical weight. Meanwhile, Hagia Sophia changed religious practice profoundly. Worship inside the cathedral produced new forms of liturgy, requiring larger choirs and more complex chant tones. Voices bounced around the dome, forming echoes that sounded angelic, reinforcing belief that the city stood under divine protection. Pilgrims described hearing hymns that felt like celestial music. Large-scale baptism ceremonies also took place inside the cathedral. Infants born after the Great Fire received names honoring saints associated with survival and resurrection. Many households named children Sophia, Anastasia, or Zoe, names symbolizing wisdom, rebirth, and life. This trend demonstrated how cultural psychology adapted to tragedy. Babies born during Reconstruction represented victory over death. Thus, post-fire Constantinople became a city shaped by its cathedral, not just physically, but socially, intellectually, culturally, and spiritually. The sense of unity that emerged was genuine, but beneath its beauty lay unresolved political questions. How long would imperial authority remain stable? How would future rulers manage expectations set by this magnificent transformation? And most importantly, what would happen when inevitable new challenges arrived? Hagia Sophia's completion marked a pinnacle of achievement, but it also signaled the beginning of a new political narrative, Justinian as God-chosen emperor of universal Christian civilization. Public perception shifted dramatically. Before the fire, Justinian was respected but questioned. After Hagia Sophia, he was revered. His authority appeared infallible, his judgment sanctified, his rule predestined. To reinforce this perception, Justinian implemented symbolic policies. Imperial ceremonies increased in scale and splendor. Gold-embroidered robes shimmered under candlelight as Justinian and Theodora appeared before the people with grand retinues. Imperial processions through the Misi Boulevard displayed wealth, order, and divine power. Soldiers marched in perfect formation. Priests carried holy relics. Incense flowed from swinging censers. Musicians performed harmonic chants, and citizens cheered from balconies. These rituals reinforced hierarchy, but also reassurance. The fires and riots had created fear of instability. Rituals restored public confidence that Constantinople's leadership stood unshaken. Justinian then used religion strategically. He sponsored missionary work aimed at converting pagan tribes surrounding the empire. Christianity spread eastward and northward, strengthening diplomatic ties. New churches appeared across provincial lands, mirroring Hagia Sophia's design style. Even distant communities felt connected culturally to Constantinople, reinforcing the empire's spiritual dominion. Within Constantinople, the cathedral became the stage for ideological messaging. Sermons proclaimed that the city's destruction had been a necessary purification before divine renewal. Priests preached that the fire served as discipline rather than punishment, teaching humility and devotion. These messages shaped civic psychology. The trauma of the riots fused into myth. The population believed that God had tested them, and that survival proved chosenness. This belief unified the city far more deeply than fear or law ever could. However, Justinian's reliance on divine identity had political risks. As his aura grew, expectations increased. People believed he could not fail, that every decision carried divine approval. If future crises emerged, disappointment might turn catastrophic. Many modern historians argue that Justinian unintentionally created a standard impossible to match. Meanwhile, Theodora ensured that imperial image did not drown government function. She intervened when spiritual symbolism overshadowed practical governance. She advocated for legal protection for women, religious minorities, and children. Under her direction, anti-trafficking laws strengthened and punishments against sexual exploitation increased. Many women saw her as their unofficial representative, believing she gave them dignity within an empire dominated by men. Yet, beneath the glory, Constantinople carried hidden fracture lines. The same centralization that made rebuilding possible now limited open criticism. Dissent became dangerous. Scholars who questioned doctrine risked exile. Artists who created unauthorized imagery faced censorship. Whisper networks formed among intellectuals who wondered whether the empire's emphasis on unity allowed enough creative freedom. Their fears were not paranoia. Justinian and Theodora monitored ideas closely. They believed that culture must support empire, not challenge it. Another issue arose from imperial spending. Hagia Sophia's enormous cost drained treasury reserves. While trade income and African revenues replenished some funds, debt remained significant. Large future projects would require tax increases or borrowing, potentially provoking new unrest. Foreign powers also recognized these internal strains. Gothic leaders in Italy spread propaganda portraying Justinian as tyrant rather than savior. Persian diplomats argued that the empire wasted resources on vanity architecture. These critiques did not change internal opinion, but they foreshadowed future geopolitical tension. Still, Hagia Sophia had permanently shifted human imagination. People believed no disaster, not fire, nor riot, nor war, could erase Constantinople again. They believed their city embodied destiny. That sense of invincibility would inspire great achievements, but also tempt future rulers toward dangerous overconfidence. Thus, while Hagia Sophia stood completed in magnificent glory, the empire entered a new phase, managing success. Empire-wide conquests, religious disputes, diplomatic rivalries, and social transformation awaited. The Great Fire remained a powerful memory, shaping choices still years ahead. Although the completion of Hagia Sophia symbolized spiritual triumph, everyday existence in Constantinople remained layered with complexity. The city's post-fire renaissance had not erased human suffering. It had merely reshaped it. Rebuilding introduced new forms of social hierarchy, changed class identities, and sparked debates over wealth, poverty, and moral responsibility. The new Constantinople no longer resembled its pre-riot form. Districts once filled with wooden homes had transformed into rows of stone structures. But construction quality varied dramatically. Wealthy neighborhoods near the Imperial Palace, the Auguste Ion, and the Grand Palace complex thrived, glittering with marble facades, mosaics, running water, and decorative gardens. But travel outward into the city's hills and neighborhoods near the land walls, and one encountered austerity instead of splendor. Houses that were built quickly to shelter the working poor. Many lacked proper foundations or architectural elegance. Walls appeared plain, windows small, and streets narrow compared to the newly designed boulevards closer to the center. This spatial contrast created a new social geography. Before the fire, the city's class barriers existed, but were blurred by faction identity. Blues and greens lived intermixed across neighborhoods. After the fire, the pattern changed. Those who possessed money or political influence gravitated inward toward the rebuilt heart of Constantinople, while lower-income families settled into outer districts where land was cheaper and imperial oversight weaker. Ironically, the fire, which many initially believed would equalize society, ended up reinforcing class divides in different forms. Still, the working classes remained deeply proud of their role in rebuilding the city. Laborers, masons, brickmakers, woodcutters, metal workers, and dock unloaders participated in monumental projects that defined Constantinople's rebirth. They walked through Hagia Sophia knowing they had carried the stones with their own hands. They saw aqueducts repaired, theaters restored, and marketplaces reshaped through labor they provided. This sense of public ownership gave them dignity and belonging. Yet social tension crept beneath the surface. Rising wages during construction temporarily improved conditions, but prices rose alongside them. Food cost more, rent increased, and tools became expensive. Many laborers discovered that although they earned coin more frequently, their purchasing power did not increase proportionately. Anxiety spread that when reconstruction ended and wages stabilized or dropped, families might face sudden poverty. Imperial economists recognized this risk and advised Justinian to diversify employment opportunities. As a result, new urban projects appeared: road expansions, harbor dredging, administrative building construction, and rural agricultural reforms in nearby provinces. Another challenge unfolded around migrant populations. Workers imported from provinces during the rebuilding period now settled permanently. Their children grew up speaking a hybrid mix of dialects. Local citizens sometimes perceived foreigners as competition. Complaints arose that newcomers received unfair access to work. Laws were created requiring guild membership for certain trades, limiting outsiders from forming monopolies. These regulations protected Constantinople's professional communities, but they also introduced early forms of urban border control, reflecting the growing complexity of identity within the capital. Religious diversity, too, shaped social debate. Although Hagia Sophia symbolized Chalcedonian orthodoxy, the empire included Armenian Christians, Monophysites, Jews, pagan remnants, and immigrant believers from Slavic and Gothic cultures. Some districts embraced diversity as a strength. Others feared cultural dilution. Heated conversations emerged about doctrinal purity, conversion, and imperial unity. Theodora's personal sympathy toward Monophysite Christians clashed with Justinian's commitment to Chalcedonian uniformity. This tension, quietly present beneath the city's spiritual unity, would later influence imperial politics long after Reconstruction ended. Meanwhile, intellectual culture penetrated every layer of society. Families who once knew only manual labor began valuing literacy. Parents sent sons, and occasionally daughters, to monastic schools or cathedral academies. They dreamed their children might escape manual labor and enter the expanding bureaucratic class. This educational hope changed family dynamics. Children earned respect, not only for strength, but for knowledge. Boys who once would have followed fathers into carpentry now trained to become scribes. Girls studied scripture and music to enter convents. But not all changes foster harmony. Wealth inequality increased and resentment simmered. Some aristocrats who lost estates during the riots clawed back economic power by purchasing land in rebuilt districts. Their regained confidence angered commoners who believed aristocracy should weaken, not thrive. Meanwhile, stories of corruption circulated. Dishonest merchants inflated prices. Officials sold building permits illegally. Tax collectors exploited legal confusion about property boundaries lost to fire. Citizens began questioning whether justice truly improved after the riots. Justinian's legal reforms created structured law, but enforcing fairness required consistent provincial and urban oversight, something the empire still struggled to achieve. Despite these tensions, Constantinople remained alive with hope. Revealed plazas hosted festivals. Poets recited verses about rebirth. Children ran through streets without fear of collapsing roofs. Markets burst with sound. Vendors selling bread. Traders advertising textiles. Musicians playing flutes. Storytellers shouting histories. The city thrived. It carried scars, but also purpose. Thus, post-fire Constantinople became a vibrant paradox. Wealth rising beside poverty, unity beside division, innovation beside inequality. The empire had survived disaster, but survival does not erase complexity, it deepens it. Beneath the flourishing surface of Constantinople existed hidden costs that would shape the empire's future. Economic, emotional, and social burdens often overshadowed by monumental success. While Hagia Sophia represented unparalleled triumph, the resources consumed to build it and other structures placed immense strain on imperial finances. Treasury records described enormous expenditures on marble shipments, gold tesserae, timber scaffolding, iron reinforcements, and mosaic labor. Even North African wealth brought from the Vandal victory could not fully cover these demands indefinitely. Justinian financed reconstruction through heavy taxation. While he offered temporary relief during the earliest rebuilding years, tax pressure returned strongly once construction matured. Egyptian grain farmers paid increased levies to supply Constantinople's expanding population. African landowners, newly integrated into the empire, were taxed to demonstrate loyalty. Italian territories under reconquest made payments toward imperial coffers, even while under siege. These demands fed frustration in distant provinces. Trouble brewed in North Africa, where Berber tribes resisted taxation. Italy, still war-torn, resented Rome's tribute expectations. Persia mocked Justinian's taxation reports, predicting internal collapse. Even within Constantinople, shopkeepers felt squeezed between fluctuating market prices and imperial tax agents. Because Justinian often associated revenue with law enforcement, tax collectors gained expanded legal power. They could seize property, imprison debtors, and shut down businesses. This system, while efficient, risked reviving the same resentment that helped trigger the Nika Riots. Another hidden cost involved personal sacrifice. Thousands of workers died during construction accidents. Their names seldom appeared in official documents. Many families lost sons, fathers, and husbands to collapsing scaffolds or falling stones. The city honored these deaths quietly. Priests held funerals, families mourned, but the empire did not glorify workers the way it glorified generals or emperors. Despite admiration for craftsmen, reality remained. History celebrates monuments, but the human bodies buried beneath them are often forgotten. Social inequality deepened subtly. While elite families filled restored villas with new luxuries imported from abroad, many common households remained fragile. Their stone homes, while safer from fire, lacked insulation, causing winter chill and summer heat to penetrate living spaces. Medical services were limited. Child mortality remained high. Economic vulnerability continued haunting daily existence. Furthermore, Reconstruction altered gender roles in complex ways. Women who gained independence during crisis years occasionally faced pressure to return to traditional domestic roles once the city stabilized. Some did return, but not all. Widows maintained businesses, inherited property, and led trade networks. Their success challenged social expectations. Meanwhile, Theodora promoted legal reforms protecting women, including laws against forced prostitution and improved divorce rights. These laws empowered some women, yet angered conservative groups who believed imperial policy undermined traditional order. Reconstruction also strained cultural identity. Citizens worried the empire moved too far from its Roman origins. Latin, once the authoritative administrative language, faded further beneath Greek usage. While Greek language strengthened communication among diverse populations, traditionalists mourned the erosion of Roman identity. They feared Constantinople, in becoming culturally Greek, lost connection to old Rome's heritage. Justinian responded by blending symbols, Roman laws, Greek culture, and Christian theology to form a hybrid imperial identity. Meanwhile, architecture itself carried emotional burden. Hagia Sophia's magnificence overshadowed smaller churches. Some community priests felt ignored, believing resources poured into one building robbed parish churches of necessary help. They argued that God lived not only in domes of gold, but in tiny chapels where fishermen prayed. Their voices rarely reached Justinian's ears, but their worries reflected spiritual diversity within the empire. Another hidden cost was intellectual pressure. Scholars writing histories of the Nika Riots faced censorship. The government wanted controlled narrative to ensure future generations viewed Justinian as savior, not authoritarian. Revised records minimized imperial brutality during the Hippodrome massacre, framing it as unavoidable justice. Certain senators' involvement in rebellion was erased from texts. The empire curated memory, proving that rebuilding included rewriting the past. Emotional burdens spread as well. Trauma resurfaced in unexpected moments, during thunderstorms when thunder resembled collapsing roofs, during feasts when fire pits reminded citizens of burning homes, during civic ceremonies when cheers echoed faintly like riot shouts. Yet even these burdens proved valuable historically. They demonstrate that Constantinople's rebirth was not a fairy tale of perfect triumph, but a human story of compromise, struggle, loss, and perseverance. The rebuilt empire carried shining domes on fractured foundations, not physically fractured, but emotionally. History later celebrated Justinian's age as golden, but beneath its gold leaf lay imperfections that made the era real. The Great Fire was not just a tragedy. It became a lens through which every future decision, every political debate, and every economic choice was judged. As Constantinople entered the final stages of major reconstruction, the empire confronted a paradox. The city was radiant, strong, and culturally advanced, yet increasingly vulnerable to new external pressures. North African reconquest, Italian wars, large-scale spending, and the psychological weight of past trauma combined to form conditions ripe for future crisis. Persia, although temporarily contained, watched Roman expansion nervously. The Sasanian Empire recognized that Justinian's success in Africa and Italy threatened their own influence. Khosrow I, the Persian ruler, believed Constantinople's prosperity after the riot tragically signaled inevitable confrontation. To him, Byzantine recovery meant military danger. Negotiations between empires grew tense. Envoys argued over trade routes, taxation of border provinces, and Christian missionary expansion. Publicly, both empires claimed peace. Privately, strategists prepared for war. Meanwhile, Italy remained highly unstable. Wars raged between Byzantine forces and the Ostrogoths year after year. Some nights, he requested private prayer sessions with monks who visited palace chambers. These monks reminded him empire needed humility. Political loneliness deepened too. Trusted allies aged or fell out of favor. Some ministers betrayed emperor through financial corruption. Justinian removed them ruthlessly. But removing corruption did not erase loneliness. Each betrayal widened emotional gap between emperor and court. Theodora remained a key source of strength, but her declining health terrified Justinian. Though imperial documents speak little about her illness publicly, private correspondence suggests she suffered recurring fevers and chronic pain. Justinian feared future without her partnership. He understood empire stability depended partly on her guidance. Their intimate conversations shaped foreign policy, religious tolerance, and domestic law. His emotional dependence on Theodora became visible during public ceremonies. He watched for her reactions before responding to questions. She understood complex palace tension instinctively. Without her, Justinian would have become harsher, colder, and more isolated. Yet even shared leadership could not protect them from pressure of expectations. Citizens greeted Justinian with immense reverence. Whenever he appeared, crowds bowed, kissed ground, and shouted praises. Sounds echoed through city. Long live the emperor chosen by God. But behind cheering voices lived hidden murmurs, concern about taxes, fear of plague rumors, resentment about war loss. Empire diversity magnified leadership complexity. Justinian ruled lands across 3 continents, cultures speaking dozens of languages. Decisions affecting Egypt angered Syrians. Policies benefiting Anatolia angered Thrace. Empire cohesion required constant negotiation. Justinian relied heavily on correspondence to govern provinces, writing hundreds of letters offering legal clarity, military commands, and tax revisions. Vast resources flowed through Constantinople's economic arteries toward the Italian front. Grain, weapons, coin, and soldiers traveled westward by the thousands. Families who had lost men in the fire now risked losing sons in war. Some began quietly opposing Justinian's expansion policy, arguing that the empire should consolidate rather than pursue endless conquest. Their whispers brought back memories of rebellion under Anastasius and other emperors. Additionnellement, climate fluctuation impacted agriculture. Several years of unusual weather patterns produced unpredictable harvests. Egyptian grain shipments occasionally arrived late or reduced in volume. When bread supply decreased, food prices rose sharply. Market riots threatened to ignite once again, and guards patrolled squares to deter unrest. The empire faced serious risk. Hunger always turned thought into anger. Disease also lurked. Crowded living conditions, refugees entering the city, and expanded trade created fertile terrain for illness. Medical observers documented strange fevers and skin infections not commonly seen before the fire. Although the devastating plague would not strike until the later 540 seconds, early symptoms hinted at epidemiological shift. Citizens could not know how drastically their lives would soon change. Meanwhile, Constantinople's very success fostered envy across the Mediterranean. Visitors described the city as unmatched in beauty and wealth, with Hagia Sophia standing like a crown of heaven on earth. Some Western Europeans believed Constantinople had achieved what Rome never fully accomplished, a city representing not only imperial might, but theological destiny. Such reputation drew admiration and hostility. Foreign leaders plotted to steal ideas, mimic architecture, or undermine Byzantine trade. Internally, the bureaucracy grew thicker. The more Justinian built, the more paperwork his empire required. Tax offices expanded. Legal courts multiplied. The military administration grew complex. Some citizens worried that imperial over-centralization suffocated individuality. Writers began producing cautionary texts warning that too much success invited disaster. They reminded people that fire began when confidence blinded vigilance. Despite these concerns, Constantinople remained vibrant. Night markets flourished. Street musicians played beneath lamplight. Scholars debated philosophy on marble porticos. Monks illuminated manuscripts, adding gold leaf that glowed beneath candles. Fishermen returned to sea each morning, their nets glistening with salt water and sun. The harbor bustled with arriving merchants. Even domestic animals, cats, dogs, horses, pigeons, became symbols of everyday life restored. Children now born into rebuilt Constantinople could not imagine the ruins their parents described. They saw clean stone roads instead of charred beams. They saw fountains instead of ruined wells. They saw Hagia Sophia glowing like a gateway to heaven instead of fragments of collapsed churches. The once horrific fire became a distant, almost mythic memory. Stories told by elders resembled ghost tales whispered before sleep. Yet elders remembered truth. Constantinople still lived under the shadow of possibility. Possibility of new fire, new riots, new wars. They prayed that future rulers would learn from Justinian's successes and failures. With reconstruction nearly complete and Constantinople transformed into a glittering beacon of imperial brilliance, one might expect the memory of the Great Fire to fade into mere historical record. Yet the emotional legacy of the catastrophe continued shaping daily thought across every class of society. Trauma does not vanish simply because buildings rise. Instead, it embeds itself within culture, language, ritual, and identity. Even with the cathedral standing in perfected splendor, citizens whispered stories at night about how the city once roared under flames. Many who survived the fire described their memories to younger generations, not as political narrative, but as cautionary tale. Parents told children that Constantinople's beauty came at terrible price. Grandparents recounted nights when smoke covered the streets so thickly that people could not see their own feet. They described sound, terrifying sound, as homes collapsed in sequence like drums. They remembered the way firelight danced on the Marmara Sea and the Bosporus, making the waters look like molten bronze. Children listened wide-eyed, imagining a mythical disaster rather than a real historical event. Through these retellings, trauma became folklore, folklore became shared identity, and shared identity became cultural strength. The fire shaped language, too. Poets coined new metaphors. A broken heart was compared to a burnt house, recovery to rebuilding walls, betrayal to the spark that ignites ruin. Musicians composed dirges dedicated to the lost, and their melodies echoed in taverns and private courtyards alike. Playwrights embedded allegory into stage dramas, stories about gods who destroyed cities to punish arrogance, only to resurrect them through love. This artistic transformation revealed emotional truth. The city continued mourning even in celebration. The clergy also preserved memory within liturgical practice. Certain feast days included prayers honoring riot victims. Some priests argued that remembrance itself was a form of justice, ensuring the dead were not erased by triumph. This reflected profound shift in empire culture. Grief was no longer weakness. It became part of national personality. But the emotional legacy also caused shadow challenges. Some people feared fire constantly. They stored water near beds, avoided candles, and kept emergency escape paths cleared inside their homes. Public paranoia occasionally sparked false alarms. Crowds would panic at smoke rising from bakeries. In a city traumatized by conflagration, even harmless chimney smoke could trigger submission into old fear responses. More subtly, the civic psyche shifted toward resilience blended with fatalism. Citizens believed the city could endure anything: riot, fire, war, famine, because Constantinople had already endured apocalypse once. This belief offered stability, but also encouraged risk. People assumed the empire was divinely protected because Hagia Sophia now stood watch. Faith empowered hope, but hope flirted with dangerous confidence. And yet, despite fear and pride sharing space, the city's emotional recovery moved steadily. Groups of storytellers visited orphan communities, performing plays about unity. Neighbors organized feast-sharing events where survivors cooked meals together to honor lost relatives. Memory became a communal project. The fire had destroyed more than architecture. It had destroyed isolation. People realized they needed one another not only for survival, but for identity itself. Thus, the emotional legacy of the fire remained deeply alive, etched into public prayer, family ritual, daily language, artistic imagination, and civic confidence. Constantinople had rebuilt walls, but hearts healed at slower pace. Parallel to emotional transformation, significant legislative reform unfolded across the empire. Justinian's decision to rebuild cities physically also extended into rebuilding justice system foundations. Before the fire, Roman law existed as a massive body of texts, contradictory statutes, forgotten precedents, and philosophical treatises that created confusion inside courts. Judges struggled to interpret unclear passages. Lawyers manipulated contradictions to serve wealthy clients, and commoners found justice almost unreachable. The Great Fire accelerated Justinian's obsession with legal clarity. The riots had emerged partly because citizens felt mistreated and unheard. Tax corruption, judicial bribery, and inconsistent sentencing had fed public anger. Justinian understood that to prevent another uprising, justice must be transparent and predictable. Thus, he ordered the completion and expansion of the Corpus Juris Civilis, his monumental legal codification project. Following Reconstruction, new legal schools opened near Hagia Sophia and the Imperial Palace. Law students studied Roman precedent, now reorganized into digestible codes. Professors taught interpretation techniques, legal philosophy, and case history. They emphasized fairness as structural necessity rather than idealistic hope. Future judges learned to apply law to protect citizens rather than manipulate them. One of the most influential legal developments of this period involved property rights. Because the fire destroyed entire neighborhoods, determining land ownership became complicated. Families claimed lots with verbal testimony since written documents burned. Justinian responded with reforms. He created legal procedures for proving property claims using witness statements, community memory, and imperial archive reconstruction. This prevented violence over land and reduced court backlog. Another major reform addressed corruption. Justinian empowered inspectors called defensors to monitor judges, tax collectors, and city officials. These inspectors reported abuses directly to the emperor, sometimes resulting in dismissal or exile of high-ranking authorities. Citizens witnessed officials punished for bribery, something unheard of before the riots. Such enforcement strengthened public trust and slowed administrative decay. Criminal reform expanded too. Punishments for arson increased significantly, reflecting trauma of the riots. Arsonists risked public execution. New fire codes regulated kitchen design, chimney construction, market stall spacing, and furnace operation. Traders storing oil faced inspections. These policies show how trauma shaped law. The city legislated against repetition of catastrophe. Additionally, new rules protected orphans, widows, and the disabled. Many lost guardians during riots, leaving them legally vulnerable. Justinian ordered guardianship standards and state oversight to prevent exploitation. This reform reflected theodictic compassion, but also political logic. Vulnerable citizens must trust empire rather than rebellion. However, not all reforms favored freedom. Justinian used legal code to strengthen imperial control. Sedition laws expanded. Criticism of emperor became dangerous. Senators lost ability to oppose legislation meaningfully. Religious heresy laws intensified, shaping doctrinal conformity. But even restrictive measures served a purpose: to protect Constantinople from chaos similar to the riots. Justinian believed order justified control. Interestingly, legal reform created unexpected social movement. Literacy increased dramatically because citizens wanted to read legal documents themselves rather than trust corrupt officials. Reading became civic empowerment. Market scribes offered services to illiterate citizens, writing letters, contracts, and petitions. Education spread outward from elite households into artisan communities. Meanwhile, funeral law evolved from necessity. Mass graves required new rituals. Legislators wrote guidelines for burial records and identification. Families received legal right to mark graves even when bodies were never recovered, acknowledging grief legally, something rare in ancient legal culture. Thus, the post-fire legal world blended compassion with authority, equality with hierarchy, and transparency with control. Justinian's codes shaped not only Byzantine civilization, but medieval Europe centuries later. Ironically, the fire that destroyed law courts produced legal architecture that survived for a millennium. No discussion of Constantinople's post-fire era can ignore Theodora, the empress whose influence defined cultural and political direction. Without her, Justinian's legacy may have fractured beneath competing priorities. She provided emotional intelligence the emperor lacked, balancing harsh law with human empathy. Her power, though often informal, shaped empire destiny. Before becoming empress, Theodora lived as actress and entertainer, a profession considered scandalous by aristocratic society. Such background gave her perspective unmatched in the palace. She understood the lives of poor citizens, orphans, prostitutes, and laborers far more intimately than any emperor born into privilege. When the Nika Riots erupted, she refused Justinian's suggestion to flee, declaring death superior to dishonor. That moment preserved the empire. After the fire, Theodora expanded social reform. She influenced laws protecting women against forced prostitution, granting them legal right to leave abusive husbands, an innovation radical in ancient world context. She funded shelters housing former entertainers, teaching them skills in weaving and reading. Her presence within policy showed that Reconstruction did not only rebuild stone, but also social dignity. Theodora also intervened in religious politics. Her sympathy toward Miaphysite Christians created networks of underground theological communication throughout the empire. She protected theologians persecuted under official doctrine. Justinian tolerated this tension partly because he loved her, partly because her diplomacy prevented violent backlash from dissenting provinces. Within palace walls, Theodora mediated between ministers, advising Justinian on when to show mercy and when to demonstrate strength. She soothed the blues after the uprising, reminding them that their loyalty must extend beyond personal benefit. She quietly counseled Belisarius' wife, Antonina, maintaining stability within military leadership households. Theodora also reshaped imperial ritual. She insisted women appear publicly in ceremonial roles, breaking precedent that royal women remain invisible. She walked in processions beside Justinian, not behind him. Citizens saw this as symbolic partnership. For women throughout empire, Theodora became proof that status could be rewritten by merit. Yet Theodora's power was not free from controversy. Aristocrats hated her influence, claiming she corrupted imperial policy. Priests accused her of overstepping female boundaries. Foreign observers described her as formidable, intimidating, fearless. But fear was her weapon. Theodora understood that in a world that despised her origins, meekness guaranteed irrelevance. Emotionally, Theodora bore enormous weight. She heard petitions from women whose children starved, whose husbands beat them, whose families died in riots. She cried with them. She angrily confronted corrupt officials. She insisted imperial spending include charity funds, not just architecture and war. Theodora knew glory meant nothing unless humanity benefited. Her leadership influenced Justinian's public image. Without her, he risked being perceived as cold engineer emperor obsessed with law and conquest. With her, the empire radiated compassion, even if unevenly distributed. Constantinople's transformation thus reflected dual minds. Justinian rebuilt structures, Theodora rebuilt souls. However, her health gradually weakened. Stress, grief over dead children, and constant pressure carved toll into her body. Court physicians documented her struggles quietly. Still, her legacy remained unstoppable. She proved that gender, class, and past could not erase brilliance. Thus, The story of Constantinople after its greatest fire is incomplete without her voice. She belonged not behind the scenes, but its center of rebirth. By the early 540s, the city flourishing under Justinian's reconstruction no longer resembled the scarred ruins left after the Great Fire. Constantinople had evolved into a cultural artery pulsing with art, music, education, literature, and theological debate. The empire had moved past basic rebuilding and entered a stage historians describe as a golden cultural bloom, a period defined by creative output and intellectual daring. Yet this brilliance existed side by side with underlying instability, as if the city balanced on a narrow thread stretched between enlightenment and disaster. The cultural bloom began in architecture, but quickly spread into philosophy. Hagia Sophia acted as a magnet for scholars across the empire. Its acoustics fascinated mathematicians, who gathered to study how sound curved along vaulted surfaces. Engineers wrote treatises explaining why the dome floated instead of collapsing under its own weight. These texts circulated through academies and influenced architecture across the Mediterranean. In later centuries, Islamic architects studying Byzantine domes learned from these writings, spreading Constantinople's genius across continents. Beyond engineering, literature flourished. Historians chronicled events of the Great Fire and Justinian's reconstruction with remarkable attention to detail. Some wrote from a strictly political view, praising imperial strength. Others crafted narrative histories, mixing emotion and philosophy. They described the riots not only as rebellion, but as moral trial. Their sentences flowed with metaphor. Fire as divine judgment, rebuilding as spiritual rebirth. Modern historians treasure these texts because they reveal psychological realities rather than just chronological fact. Poetry expanded as well. Writers used imagery of marble and flame to explore human struggle. Many poems reflected on fragility, how the world could turn from peace to chaos in a single day. Others celebrated Hagia Sophia as moonlight caught in stone. These literary works reached ordinary citizens. People copied poems onto scraps of parchment, recited them in taverns, sang them at funerals, and whispered them during prayer. Culture was no longer confined to elite universities. It lived in the streets. Artistic workshops thrived. Icon painters invented new visual languages using jewel-toned pigments and layered gold leaf. Glass makers experimented with colored tesserae used for mosaics. Their work glittered across palace halls, baths, and churches. Sculptors carved capitals, angels, and floral patterns inspired by both Roman and Eastern styles. Artists competed for imperial commissions, knowing that a mosaic placed inside Hagia Sophia could immortalize them. Music evolved uniquely during this era. Choral traditions adapted to the cathedral's acoustics, developing long, sustained tones that resonated across vast space. These chants influenced Byzantine music permanently. Musicologists today still analyze harmonic technique used in Justinianic-era hymns. The sound triggered emotional transformation. Listeners reported hearing echoes that felt like voices of invisible angels. Whether exaggeration or truth, this reveals how spiritual architecture shaped sensory perception. Education expanded, both formal and informal. Schools opened for orphans, teaching them literacy, mathematics, and theology. Monasteries acted as learning centers, training scribes to copy religious texts. Aristocratic families hired tutors to teach children rhetoric and philosophy. Women also participated indirectly through convent education, receiving instruction in scripture, literature, and sometimes history. Though equality remained distant, opportunity broadened. This relentless responsibility shaped emotional identity of ruler. He no longer saw himself as individual, but as embodiment of empire. Every choice carried historical weight. Every mistake threatened future memory. Yet despite burden, Justinian sought moments of private humanity. Court tales describe him visiting gardens at dawn when city silent. He observed flowers along palace wall, listened to water trickle from fountain, watched sunrise over Bosporus. These brief moments grounded him emotionally. They reminded Emperor World contained peace beyond politics. He sometimes watched children play inside palace courtyard as noble families visited. Seeing laughter comforted him. It represented future generations inheriting rebuilt empire. Sometimes he asked young boys to recite poetry or girls to sing hymns. These performances softened imperial hardness temporarily, but no moment fully erased weight on his shoulders. He believed history would judge him not for personal happiness, but for empire's shape upon his death. And so Justinian continued pushing, planning, and building relentlessly. As the 540s advanced, two looming events prepared to reshape his emotional world forever: loss of Theodora and arrival of plague. Both would test everything reconstructed after fire: architecture, law, faith, government, army, and Justinian's own endurance. By the late 540s, Constantinople stood unquestionably magnificent, a mirror of imperial ambition and architectural triumph. Yet beneath shimmering domes and marble plazas, an invisible threat prepared to strike. One not born from fire or riot, but from microscopic life traveling across seas. Long before the plague arrived, whispers circulated through trade routes linking Constantinople to Egypt. Rumors emerged of strange fevers destroying entire villages along Nile banks. Sailors returning from Alexandria described unbearable sickness in ports, swollen lymph nodes, hallucinations, bleeding sores, and corpses filling streets. However, the intellectual bloom invited conflict. With thought expanding, arguments about theology intensified. Constantinople became philosophical battleground over Christ's nature, sin, free will, and interpretation of Scripture. Different Christian schools debated fiercely, sometimes publicly. Justinian supported Chalcedonian doctrine, but dissent never disappeared. Travelers brought foreign ideas too, especially from Alexandria and Antioch, cities known for philosophical daring. These external influences clashed with traditionalists, protecting Constantinople's orthodox legacy. This cultural dynamism mirrored the city's emotional arc. From ashes came imagination. From trauma came creativity. People found meaning by writing, crafting, painting, singing, and thinking. They were determined to prove that destruction did not silence the soul, it awakened it. Yet, beneath this cultural brilliance, Constantinople also carried quiet fears. The same roads that carried ideas carry disease. The same foreign workers who enriched the city also introduced unknown viruses. The same cultural freedom that birthed creativity threatened orthodoxy. The fire had been physical catastrophe. Future catastrophe might come through thought, illness, war, or economics. Citizens sensed these tensions, even if they could not name them. Thus, Constantinople lived with beauty and vulnerability intertwined, its brilliance shimmering like stained glass, fragile, radiant, and unforgettable. Although art and education flourished, intellectual conflict within Constantinople grew increasingly heated. The empire found itself divided not by chariot factions anymore, but by theological argument. The question occupying minds was not entertainment, but doctrine. How should Christ's nature be understood? Was he purely divine? Purely human? A perfect fusion of both. These disputes did not begin after the fire. They had simmered for decades, but trauma from the riots intensified spiritual anxiety. People wanted answers that explained suffering. Justinian positioned himself as defender of orthodoxy. He believed empire unity depended on spiritual unity. To him, religious disagreement threatened imperial stability just as severely as rebellion. As a result, he used law to guide theology. He called church councils, published doctrinal decrees, and imprisoned heretics. Yet, the more force he applied, the more debate expanded, because intellectual suppression rarely kills thought. It often fuels it. One of the fiercest conflicts centered between Chalcedonian and Miaphysite Christians. Chalcedonians argued Christ existed in two natures, human and divine, united without confusion. Miaphysites believed Christ's nature formed a singular, united, divine human essence. To modern ears, this may appear an abstract linguistic debate, but to 6th century Byzantines, it shaped identity, politics, and salvation. After the fire, these arguments gained new emotional weight. Some survivors believed the disaster represented judgment against doctrinal corruption. They claimed Constantinople burned because Christians debated instead of unified. Others argued the fire represented purification, revealing truth through suffering. These interpretations shaped sermons, poetry, street debate, and university lectures. Colleges sometimes experienced riots when students fought over doctrine. Professors found themselves targets of public praise or accusation. Theodora added complexity to theological landscape. As empress, her political loyalty rested with Justinian, but her spiritual loyalty leaned toward Miaphysite believers. She hosted private religious meetings inside palace rooms, sheltering clergy condemned by imperial courts. Under her order, fugitives hid inside monasteries, avoiding execution. Historians interpret this duality in several ways. Some view her as protector of conscience against tyranny, others as traitor to orthodoxy. Reality likely lies between extremes. Theodora valued unity, but refused to abandon spiritual compassion. She understood that suppression breeds rebellion, and rebellion breeds ruin. This theological tension influenced cultural production. Writers embedded Christological ideology into poems, plays, and historical chronicles. Scriptoria copied texts supporting both sides, some praising council rulings, others defending dissent. Even art reflected debate. Mosaics depicted Christ in different visual interpretations: youthful human ruler or cosmic divine monarch. These images subtly represented doctrinal positions. Meanwhile, education sharpened ideological conflict. Schools taught rhetoric. Students learned to debate logically, speak persuasively, and defend ideas through structured argument. These skills heightened theological confrontation rather than calming it. Young scholars challenged older priests, believing new interpretations superior to tradition. Yet despite conflict, what emerges historically is not chaos, but vitality. Cities without thought stagnate. Constantinople thrived by thinking boldly, even dangerously. The fire behind them made citizens unafraid of intellectual heat. They had lived through worse. Still, intellectual vibrancy carried risk. Imperial advisors warned Justinian that theological obsession distracted from foreign threats. Persia observed Byzantine division carefully, hoping internal argument weakened military focus. In Italy, Ostrogothic resistance gained momentum partly because Constantinople's attention split between war and religious politics. Another layer of intellectual conflict unfolded in jurisprudence. Justinian believed law expressed divine order. Scholars trained in legal studies often clashed with theologians trained in scripture. Disputes arose over whether scripture or law held higher authority during conflict between human rights and divine decree. These conflicts revealed deeper truth. Constantinople, rebuilt in stone, struggled to rebuild in thought. The Great Fire forced practical reconstruction, but spiritual reconstruction required philosophical courage. Citizens learned that rebuilding minds can be harder than rebuilding walls. And yet, through argument, prayer, art, and education, Constantinople slowly developed a more sophisticated identity, one shaped by both unity and disagreement. While Constantinople dazzled culturally and intellectually, another force quietly approached. The simple reality that no city, no empire, no civilization escapes time. Beneath all achievement rested seeds of future crisis. The Great Fire had taught that disaster could come without warning. Those who studied history knew cycles. Prosperity invites vulnerability, expansion invites resistance, and brilliance invites jealousy. Economically, the city depended on uninterrupted trade to feed its population. Grain ships from Egypt remained lifeline. If Nile floods failed or Egyptian politics shifted, Constantinople could starve. Merchants warned of supply irregularity. Scholars noted unusual weather patterns, subtle but concerning. Cold winters appeared colder, and hot summers hotter. Harvest reports suggested shifting climate across Mediterranean lands. In ancient society, even slight weather change could trigger famine. Meanwhile, imperial treasury strain deepened. Hagia Sophia, conquest campaigns, legal reform, and welfare systems required massive spending. The emperor's dream of universal Roman restoration cost coins by the millions. While victories brought wealth, war expenses multiplied faster than income. Some advisors recommended retreat from Italy, arguing empire could not sustain endless conflict. Justinian refused. He believed victory halfway achieved must be completed. Administratively, the empire grew too complex to manage efficiently. Taxes flowed upward, reports downward, laws sideways. Bureaucracy expanded into tangled network. Some citizens resented seeing more officials than soldiers in the streets. They whispered that palace scribes held more power than generals. Paperwork slowed legal cases. Corruption returned beneath surface. Militarily, Constantinople relied heavily on Belisarius. Yet Justinian mistrusted him. Their relationship resembled two lions sharing throne room shadows, one powerful by office, the other powerful by charisma. Suspicion between emperor and general threatened unity. Socially, generational divide widened. Elders valued memory of fire and humility. Youth, raised inside reborn city, valued ambition and progress. They did not understand trauma shaping their parents. Some saw fearfulness of older generation as weakness. Meanwhile, elders feared youthful confidence invited new disaster. Religiously, theological disputes boiled beneath public calm. Factions formed, not chariot factions, but ideological ones. Intellectuals debating Christ's essence mirrored earlier chariot rivalries in intensity. Arguments grew personal. Accusations of heresy increased. Imperial censors began monitoring sermons more closely. And then, the greatest unseen threat, disease. Reports arrived of strange sickness in Persian territories to the east. Fevers killing entire families, swollen glands, and deadly infections spreading between trade ports. Constantinople remained untouched, but scholars warned such plague could reach capital within years because trade expanded faster than medicine. Few listened. Prosperity deafens caution. Still, at this moment in history, before plague arrived, Constantinople radiated brilliance unmatched in the Western world. Ships sailed into the Golden Horn daily, carrying spices from India, silk from Asia, grain from Egypt, wine from Greece, timber from the Black Sea, and ideas from every horizon. Streets filled with languages: Greek, Latin, Armenian, Syriac, Gothic, Slavic, Coptic, Arabic. Markets overflowed with goods. Lanterns glowed inside taverns. Priests chanted evening hymns. Children ran laughing along marble courtyards. The city seemed immortal. But those who remembered the Great Fire understood truth. Immortality lasts only until next spark. They saw beauty but sensed fragility beneath it. They hoped future generations would honor lessons already written across stone: humility, vigilance, unity, and compassion. Constantinople had risen from death stronger than ever, but history promised that new tests awaited. Soon, forces beyond fire, war, plague, political strain, and shifting world power would challenge everything Justinian built. Although Hagia Sophia dominated the physical and spiritual skyline of Constantinople, another world shaped imperial identity just as powerfully: the inner workings of Justinian's court. Behind marble walls, gardens, and mosaic corridors, political relationships unfolded through conversation, rumor, ambition, and rivalry. The palace functioned not only as symbol of power, but as living stage where interests collided silently. After the Great Fire, palace culture changed dramatically. The disaster had purged old aristocratic influences, destroyed networks of inherited wealth, and elevated new bureaucratic families who gained status through service rather than lineage. To understand post-fire Constantinople, one must explore how court society worked. The imperial palace represented a self-contained city with its own guards, kitchens, libraries, chapels, artisans, scholars, servants, and secret police. Daily routines operated according to strict protocol. Officials woke before dawn, preparing documents for imperial review. Eunuchs oversaw household management, palace security, and ceremonial organization. Eunuchs formed one of the most influential classes in palace culture because their proximity to rulers granted them unmatched access to secrets. Many historians underestimate eunuchs, yet they wielded enormous political leverage, often more than generals outside the palace walls. Theodora understood eunuch influence early and cultivated relationships within that network. She appointed trusted eunuchs to oversee charitable institutions and palace communication channels. Their loyalty gave her control over what information reached Justinian. She ensured that harmful rumors were filtered, while essential warnings reached the emperor quickly. Justinian accepted this system because it worked. Theodora's political instincts shielded the empire from manipulation and flattery. Meanwhile, court intellectuals thrived. Scholars arrived daily to present theological notes, architectural insights, and legal interpretations. Some read poetry allowed to entertain the imperial family. Philosophers debated moral questions about leadership and justice. This intellectual climate turned the palace into a university-like environment. Yet, beneath intellectual elegance, power games thrived. Court scholars competed for imperial approval, hoping to gain patronage, property, or legal privilege. Senators returned to palace circles with reduced prestige. The Senate Hall resumed activity, but senators no longer dared challenge imperial policy. They shifted identities, transforming from independent power brokers into advisors who accepted that the emperor held final authority. Many aristocrats attempted to rebuild wealth through cultural patronage, sponsoring artists, scholars, and churches. The palace welcomed such gestures because they strengthened Constantinople's artistic character. Women also influenced palace cultural structure in transformative ways. Theodora's presence legitimized female intellectual participation. Noble women supported manuscripts, school programs, and religious debate. Some palace women wrote letters that historians now consider early feminist expressions, critiquing social norms, questioning marriage practices, and defending women's property rights. Their voices rarely survived outside elite circles, but they shaped attitudes inside court society. The palace served as diplomatic theater too. Ambassadors visiting from Persia, Africa, Italy, and barbarian kingdoms witnessed staged demonstrations of majesty. They saw marble halls lined with guards, fountains flowing under candlelight, and mosaics depicting imperial glory. Court musicians played hymns while dancers performed choreographed movements. The goal was psychological: make foreign powers believe Constantinople possessed limitless wealth and stability. Diplomacy relied not only on negotiation, but on spectacle. Yet palace power offered danger. Alliances formed and shattered silently. Letters circulated through underground channels, spreading whispers about betrayals. Eunuchs, soldiers, and scholars occasionally became pawns in larger political struggles. While the fire had ended faction street violence, political violence inside palace chambers never ceased entirely. Poisonings, frame jobs, and career assassinations shaped silent narrative beneath public order. Justinian balanced these dynamics through discipline structure. He believed palace order reflected divine order. Anyone disrupting harmony risked exile or execution, not always through public spectacle, but through quiet disappearance. Thus, palace society after the Great Fire represented new imperial organization: bureaucratic, intellectual, centralized, and theatrical. It contrasted dramatically with pre-fire aristocratic dominance. Constantinople reinvented not only its buildings, but its ruling class. Power shifted from families with land to minds with learning. One of the most fascinating developments in post-fire Constantinople involved the explosion of cultural patronage connected to the palace. Justinian and Theodora actively encouraged artistic production because they understood culture as political tool. Art shaped identity, identity shaped loyalty, and loyalty shaped stability. The empire rose from ashes partly because culture became national glue. Theodora championed icon production. She sponsored painters, sculptors, textile weavers, and calligraphers. Art workshops produced icons depicting saints associated with healing and protection: Saint Michael, Saint George, Saint Theodore. Households hung these icons inside doorways to guard against fire. For many families, icons also represented memory of lost relatives. Some preserved locks of hair behind paintings, believing spiritual connection endured through imagery. Textile art flourished. Weavers created silk tapestries illustrating scenes from Hagia Sophia's construction. Cloth sellers displayed fabrics dyed with indigo, saffron, and madder red. Nobles purchased silk garments embroidered with stars or floral patterns symbolizing paradise. Clothing became dialogue between identity and faith. People wore designs representing survival, wisdom, or peace. Literature expanded through imperial sponsorship. Writers received palace stipends to compose histories, poems, sermons, and academic treatises. Unlike pre-fire era, writing no longer depended solely on private aristocratic funding. The state invested in culture systematically. This provided stability for scholars, allowing them to produce long-form works without economic worry. One remarkable cultural change involved bookmaking. Before the fire, books were limited luxury items. After Reconstruction, book production increased dramatically. Imperial scriptoria trained dozens of scribes to create manuscripts for libraries and cathedral archives. Bookbinding techniques improved. Ornamental covers decorated with ivory, gemstones, or painted would become prized possessions. As literacy spread, bookshops emerged near academic districts. Citizens purchased small psalm books, prayer guides, or poetic volumes. Reading became public recreation rather than elite privilege. The rise of calligraphy also transformed communication. Letters between officials now arrive decorated with artistic flourish. Fine inkwork, illuminated capital initials, and complex seals. Even business contracts adopted aesthetic beauty. This blending of art and administrative function revealed Byzantine identity. Beauty belonged everywhere, not only in sacred spaces. Music institutions benefited too. Choir schools trained young boys to perform in Hagia Sophia services. Their instruction included vocal training, musical theory, breath discipline, and memorization of entire hymn cycles. Music education strengthened spiritual life and elevated common citizens. Some boys from humble families gained prestige by singing before emperor. Public performance expanded cultural connection among social classes. Theater returned in rebuilt amphitheaters, though with modified forms. Comedies mocked social arrogance. Tragedies confronted ethical questions. Actors performed stories about past disasters, encouraging reflection rather than repression. Unlike pagan Roman theater, Byzantine theater often blended entertainment with religious morality. However, cultural bloom also generated tension. Traditionalists argued artistic expression strayed too close to vanity. They feared emphasis on beauty distracted from worship. They denounced theater as sinful, claiming performance inspired temptation. They believed mosaics depicting imperial figures risked idolatry. Yet such criticism failed to halt cultural expansion. Artistic energy was too powerful. At first, citizens dismissed these stories as exaggeration. Disease existed everywhere in ancient world. Malaria, fevers, dysentery. So talk of deadly illness did not initially alarm urban society. But medical scholars within the city recognized unusual patterns. Physicians studying correspondence from Egypt noticed rapid spread, high mortality, and uniform symptom description. They read of victims dying within days of first fever. They read of animals turning ill. They read of unburied corpses feeding rats. Rats, those tiny creatures that scurried through Constantinople's grain warehouses, became subjects of conversation. Some healers theorized illness traveled through rodent bites. Others suggested contaminated air rising from decaying bodies. They did not know plague bacterium, but they sensed something catastrophic unfolding. Justinian's advisors presented reports to emperor. Concerns formed uneasy cloud around palace. Memories of great fire resurfaced as metaphor. Citizens recalled how city once ignored early sparks, believing flames would fade until entire capital burned. Elders now feared history repeating through different form, disease rather than fire. Trade ships continued to arrive daily. Dock workers unloaded grain sacks, unaware fleas clung to fibers. Markets filled with imported spices, fabrics, and livestock. Constantinople thrived on global movement. Yet this same interconnected trade web provided perfect bridge for plague. Rats hiding between cargo boards carried fleas infected with deadly microorganisms. They scurried into granaries, kitchens, sewers, stables, and bedrooms. Still, weeks passed while city lived in denial. People attended banquets, celebrated weddings, gathered in taverns, and watched chariot races. Priests offered sermons about divine blessings protecting city. Poems described Constantinople as eternal flame untouched by decay. Citizens believed life would continue unbroken forever. Culture also shaped political image. Foreign ambassadors described Constantinople as city of learning, surpassing Rome and Alexandria. Scholars in Persia translated Byzantine writings, hoping to understand empire strength. Western rulers envied Constantinople's libraries and mosaics. The irony behind cultural bloom was that it grew not from peaceful prosperity, but from catastrophe. The Great Fire broke traditional social patterns. People who lost everything turned toward imagination because imagination required no physical possession. Cultural expression became survival instinct. This dynamic resembled urban renewal in modern societies. Trauma breeds creativity because destruction strips away illusion, leaving raw human need to rebuild meaning. Justinian saw this instinct and turned it into empire-wide advantage. Thus, post-fire, Constantinople became cultural powerhouse, a city where art, music, writing, and scholarship reached heights unmatched in medieval history. Yet culture alone could not guarantee stability. Another force remained equally powerful: rumor. Rumor was an invisible but influential force shaping Constantinople. After the Nika Riots, the empire learned that false whispers could spark disaster as effectively as torches. To maintain peace, imperial advisors sought to understand how gossip formed and how to control it. Before the fire, rumor traveled through taverns, faction gatherings, and market gossip. After rebuilding, rumor traveled through schools, churches, and professional guilds. Population literacy increased communication speed. Ideas moved faster. Truth and falsehood intertwined. New networks, scribes, merchants, monks created pipelines of information connecting distant communities. The government responded by building intelligence systems. Spies entered taverns to listen for complaints against emperor. Informants circulated among teacher circles, recording conversation topics. The goal was not mass oppression, but early detection of threatening narratives. Government feared rumors about tax rises, military defeat, or imperial illness. Yet suppression did not eliminate rumor. It transformed it. Whispering became subtle art. Citizens spoke in metaphor, using coded poetry to mask criticism. Writers invented fictional characters who symbolized real ministers. Art shifted allegorical. Mosaics depicted mythical beasts representing corruption, pride, and greed. Authorities struggled to interpret whether messages reflected rebellion or harmless creativity. Rumors shaped public perception of Justinian and Theodora. Some believed emperor was chosen by God. Others feared he risked divine wrath through pride. Some praised Theodora as saintly protector of the poor. Others accused her of secret cruelty. Truth rarely mattered. Belief shaped power. Stories about Belisarius circulated too. Some claimed he planned revolt. Others insisted he was too loyal to betray emperor. These rumors eroded trust between ruler and general. Justinian, though rational, remained human. He could not ignore repeated whispers. Suspicion slowly poisoned relationship. Rumor also amplified spiritual anxiety. Tales spread about omens. Ravens circling Hagia Sophia, stars falling from sky, earthquakes near the walls. Citizens interpreted natural events as prophecy warning empire of future suffering. Dream interpreters became popular. People paid monks to decode visions. Yet rumor's most dangerous mutation involved prophecy surrounding fire. Some predicted Constantinople would burn again in 50-year cycles. Others claimed second fire would coincide with end of world. Even children learned these predictions, repeating them in schoolyards. Government attempted to calm fears through public reassurance. Priests preached that God would protect city because Hagia Sophia sanctified ground. But older citizens remembered 532. They knew divine promise did not prevent disaster. Rumor turned attention toward the sky. Astrologers gained fame interpreting celestial events. They predicted good harvests, war victories, or plagues using mathematics and star positioning. Some citizens relied on astrology more than law. Justinian tolerated astrology because it entertained people and occasionally offered political advantage. But he banned predictions claiming imperial death dates. Rumor also reflected class tension. Poor families whispered that rich officials hid wealth stolen during rebuilding contracts. Aristocrats whispered that lower classes became unruly through education. Migrant workers whispered that locals despised them. These whisper networks revealed emotional fractures beneath empire unity. Still, rumor also served positive purpose. It carried information quickly. Citizens learned news before official announcements. Merchants used rumor to predict market changes. Sailors used rumor to avoid dangerous sea routes. Teachers used rumor to discuss political philosophy. Thus, rumor functioned as an informal news system, messy, emotional, but deeply human. The government understood it could not silence rumor. It could only manage narrative. They encouraged stories about Justinian's victory, Hagia Sophia's glory, and empire's divine destiny. They fed hope deliberately because hope countered fear. And so Constantinople became city of two truths, truth of law and truth of rumor. Both shaped history. As the empire moved deeper into the 540s, rumor foreshadowed two major turning points: the arrival of plague and a shifting balance of imperial power. By the middle of Justinian's reign, the imperial bureaucracy had expanded beyond anything the city had ever seen. Although rebuilding after the Great Fire focused public attention on architecture and spiritual rebirth, equally transformative changes unfolded within layers of government administration. These shifts created a new kind of Roman society, deeply institutional, highly literate, and governed as much by ink as by sword. Before the fire, governmental authority relied on aristocratic networks. Local nobles controlled land, households, and regional influence. They held Senate seats and shaped political opinion. After the riots, Justinian viewed aristocracy as unstable. Many senators, he believed, had secretly aided faction violence or fueled unrest by spreading rumor and opposing taxation. Thus, the emperor used Reconstruction to alter power distribution across the empire. In the newly rebuilt Constantinople, imperial officials filled government positions once held by hereditary elites. Educated scribes, legal advisors, architects, surveyors, and accountants gained unprecedented prestige. Justinian trusted knowledge more than ancestry. He wanted government run by men who owed their careers entirely to imperial patronage. This policy produced a class shift that reshaped society permanently. People realized literacy could elevate status higher than noble birth. The bureaucracy grew into a complex network of offices controlling taxation, military supply, city planning, legal courts, and religious administration. Records expanded dramatically. Scribes documented everything: births, deaths, land boundaries, commercial contracts, tax receipts, court rulings, grain distribution, imperial property, and military reports. Archives filled with scrolls and codices. This institutional explosion changed daily urban life. Citizens interacted with bureaucracy constantly, seeking licenses to open shops, paying duties on imported goods, registering property sales, requesting legal documents, or applying for construction approval. The government touched every corner of private existence. Bureaucrats gained influence as interpreters between imperial law and common citizens. Some used responsibility honorably. Others seized opportunities for bribery. The imperial administration also transformed urban infrastructure. After the fire, city planning was no longer improvisational. Engineers measured streets, standardized building dimensions, regulated fireproof material usage, and enforced safety codes. Municipal workers maintained aqueducts, cisterns, roads, and drainage networks. Public fountains operated under strict supervision. Market inspectors tested bread weight, fish freshness, and wine purity. Bureaucratic oversight allowed Constantinople to function not simply as city of belief or beauty, but city of efficiency. Still, this growth produced political consequences. Because administration expanded, state taxes had to rise. To pay thousands of government salaries, the imperial treasury demanded revenue from across the empire. African farms, Italian estates, Thracian villages, Syrian merchant cities, and Egyptian fields. Tax burden increased everywhere. And although Justinian stabilized economy through trade and conquest, ordinary citizens often felt squeezed. These economic realities shaped class dynamics. A new middle class emerged. Bureaucratic families with steady income, home ownership, and educational background. They lived near administrative districts, sent children to schools, and participated in intellectual circles. Their pride came not from military valor or aristocratic blood, but from literacy and stability. For the first time, empire identity moved beyond war elite and land elite toward managerial elite. Meanwhile, traditional aristocrats faced identity crisis. Their influence faded, yet their wealth remained. Many responded by reinventing themselves as patrons of art or religion, donating funds to monasteries, libraries, and cultural causes. Others clung to nostalgia for old Rome's social structure, gathering in private villas to lament a changing world. At lower levels of society, Reconstruction provided jobs, but not equality. Urban workers earned wages, but wealth flowed upward through bureaucratic channels and aristocratic property networks. Artisans remained essential, but undervalued. Farmers supplying food still lived under harsh conditions. Unequal prosperity shaped resentment. Yet the bureaucratic system also provided hope. Education became door to upward mobility. Sons of carpenters entered schools, mastered literacy, and later became accountants or clerks. Some reached senior government ranks within a generation. This mobility, unthinkable centuries earlier, altered how people understood destiny. New imperial administration reflected post-fire ideology. The empire survived because it changed. Government did not rebuild old system. It created new one born from necessity, trauma, intelligence, and ambition. In many ways, bureaucracy became the spine of Byzantine civilization. While bureaucracy reshaped internal government, the military underwent parallel evolution. During Reconstruction, soldiers who once battled rebels inside the Hippodrome now marched across continents. Justinian envisioned a military not simply defending borders, but reclaiming Roman world. This ambition demanded organizational revision, innovation, and discipline. The post-fire army abandoned faction loyalty. Before 532, many soldiers identified with blues or greens. Their political loyalty mirrored circus divisions. After the riots, Justinian enforced strong separation between military identity and urban faction identity. He reorganized regiments to remove soldiers from local loyalties. Foreign troops increased in number. Huns, Goths, Armenians, and Slavs served alongside native Romans. Diversity strengthened discipline because soldiers bonded through shared purpose rather than faction rivalry. Recruitment expanded through empire. Young men from Anatolia, Syria, and Thrace joined legions, drawn by pay and prestige. Military academies trained officers in tactics, logistics, and siege warfare. Scholars documented military engineering techniques, teaching soldiers mathematics, mapping, and structural knowledge. War became science, not brute aggression. Belisarius led transformation through example. His African and Italian campaigns demonstrated mobility, intelligence, and adaptability. He coordinated infantry and cavalry tactics, employing horse archers and heavy cavalry to strike with speed. His leadership style valued loyalty and respect. Soldiers adored him. However, success built jealousy. Justinian feared Belisarius might someday draw loyalty away from emperor. To control him, Justinian periodically recalled Belisarius to Constantinople, then redeployed him under restricted command. These political maneuvers reflected ancient insecurity. Emperor and general must balance partnership and rivalry. Military transformation also shaped urban culture. Returning veterans influenced Constantinople socially and psychologically. Some arrived with spoils. Gold coins, captured jewelry, rare cloth, exotic animals. Their presence represented empire's strength, inspiring awe among civilians. Others returned wounded, missing limbs, blinded eyes, scarred faces. Their visible injuries reminded citizens that glory cost human sacrifice. Widows lined streets to mourn lost husbands. The war beyond city walls touched every family. Military spending influenced economy as well. Weapon forging workshops grew significantly. Blacksmiths produced armor, swords, spearheads, arrowheads, helmets, and shield plates. Tanneries processed leather for saddles and boots. Shipyards constructed fleets for naval deployment. These industries shaped employment patterns. Young men often preferred joining military or related industries over guild crafts because military pay seemed more secure. The army also built roads, bridges, and fortifications across empire, connecting provinces to Constantinople. Trade benefited from these logistical improvements, strengthening internal markets. Soldiers stationed abroad learned foreign customs, introducing multicultural flavor in a city. Yet military expansion strained population. Farmers lost sons, provinces lost workers. Draft quotas disrupted agricultural output. Critics argued Justinian pursued conquest without considering long-term cost. But supporters insisted reconquest restored Rome's destiny. Within Constantinople, military culture influenced public behavior. Children played soldier games in streets, mimicking cavalry charges. Tavern storytellers recited battle epics. Veterans taught swordplay to students. Military ideals shaped masculinity, strength, loyalty, endurance. However, deeper tension simmered beneath pride, resentment toward war casualties. Some families whispered that Justinian cared more about lands abroad than people at home. Others accused him of vanity, believing restoring Rome's borders mattered less than improving living conditions. Another military issue emerged involving mercenaries. Although foreign troops strengthened army, their loyalty depended on continued payment. If treasury weakened, mercenaries could rebel. This potential threat lay quietly beneath structure of military triumph. Thus, Constantinople's military transformation reflected both genius and risk. It embodied hope, pride, possibility, and fear. The fire that once consumed city walls now fueled empire's outward expansion, but expansion required constant blood, coin, and loyalty. History shows that no empire can wage eternal war without consequence. Storm clouds gathered silently on horizon. No aspect of Constantinople reveals social transformation more clearly than class dynamics after Reconstruction. Before the Great Fire, the city's hierarchy followed Roman traditions. Aristocrats at top, merchants below, artisans beneath them, and slaves forming lowest social rung. Reconstruction destabilized these divisions. Fire destroyed noble estates. Some aristocrats lost wealth completely. Reconstruction introduced economic opportunity for laborers. Some became business owners. Cultural shifts encouraged intellectual achievement rather than birth prestige. The new class landscape resembled mosaic, shifting, patterned, complex. At top remained imperial elites. Emperor, empress, high ministers, generals, patriarch, and aristocratic families who retained wealth. They lived in lavish homes with mosaic flooring, marble columns, servants, and personal chapels. Their daily life involved council meetings, diplomatic receptions, banquet evenings, and organized hunts. Beneath them emerged bureaucratic professional class, scribes, lawyers, engineers, architects, and scholars. They lived modestly but proudly. Their income allowed education for children, stable housing, and food security. They valued knowledge and law as path to influence. Some built libraries inside homes. Others hosted literature discussion groups. This class believed empire stood strongest when reason guided rule. Below professional class existed artisans and merchants, the backbone of Reconstruction economy. They manufactured tools, produced food, built ships, and maintained city infrastructure. Artisans held pride in skills. Marble carvers, carpenters, metalworkers, painters, and weavers. Merchant traders traveled across seas to sell goods in foreign markets. They earned wealth, but lacked political influence. Laborers formed numerous next tier: dock unloaders, stable boys, fishmongers, bakers, tailors, and road workers. Many lived in outer districts, sharing homes among families. Their lives involved long hours, low pay, and physical risk. But unlike pre-fire era, they possessed opportunity to climb upward if children received education. Slavery still existed, though less brutally than in classical Rome. Domestic slaves worked inside houses, some trusted with finances or childcare. Others labored in fields outside city. Manumission remained pathway to freedom. Some freed slaves entered artisan trade, or even became minor officials. But rebuilding also created underclass of widows, orphans, and the disabled. Many survivors could not work due to trauma or injury. Public charity and church aid supported them, yet poverty persisted. Another key development involved migrant communities. Thousands of workers from Syria, Armenia, Cappadocia, and Balkans settled permanently after construction. Their traditions reshaped Constantinople's culture. Markets sold Syrian spices and Armenian jewelry. Taverns played foreign music. Intermarriage produced multilingual families. This diversity benefited city, but also caused identity debate. What did it mean to be Constantinopolitan? Ethnic stereotypes emerged. Some locals saw Armenians as shrewd traders, Syrians as skilled calligraphers, Cappadocians as loyal soldiers. Although stereotypes oversimplified identity, they shaped social interaction. Religion, too, influenced class structure. Monks held spiritual authority, surpassing aristocrats in moral respect. Some monasteries owned property and managed schools. Monastic leaders acted as advisors to emperors, demonstrating that faith and education formed alternative power path. Meanwhile, faction culture, once dominant, declined. Blues and greens lost political identity, but remained cultural associations through sporting events. Their power never returned to pre-fire level because bureaucracy replaced them. Women experienced contradictory class mobility. Wealthy women gained education and influence. Some managed estates and business contracts. Middle-class women assisted husbands in shops or workshops. Poor women sold bread, fruit, or textiles in markets. Former entertainers found refuge through Theodora's reforms. But gender inequality remained steep. Women still lacked legal independence at level men possessed. Thus, End of plague marked beginning of new Byzantine world, one defined not by glory alone, but by memory, humility, caution, courage, and reborn identity. In the years following the plague, the empire faced another emotional storm, one quieter than riots and subtler than disease, yet equally transformative: the gradual decline and eventual death of Empress Theodora. Her illness did not strike suddenly, nor did it erupt in spectacle as plague had done. Instead, it crept slowly, quietly weakening her body even while her mind and influence remained sharp. Theodora had long been pillar beside Justinian, political partner, emotional anchor, moral advisor, and visionary reformer. Without her, the palace walls felt less certain, less guarded, as if protective wind surrounding imperial throne began to fade. Theodora's health had already shown signs of deterioration before the plague. Court physicians recorded bouts of fatigue, severe stomach pains, and recurring weakness. At first, Justinian dismissed her exhaustion as consequence of constant responsibility. After all, she set pace equal to emperor, reviewing reports, writing letters, speaking with bishops, visiting hospitals, studying law drafts, and negotiating behind scenes with foreign emissaries. But as months passed, symptoms worsened. Theodora could no longer stand through long ceremonial events. She spent afternoons resting rather than presiding over gatherings. Whisper networks throughout palace speculated, some claiming poison, others divine punishment, others natural illness. No one truly knew. Theodora, however, refused public retreat. She continued advising Justinian intensely, but shifted methods. Instead of walking halls, giving instructions, she summoned ministers to private chambers where she spoke from couch supported by pillows. She delivered orders calmly, sometimes smiling at officials who offered reassurances she did not need. They pretended she looked strong. She pretended to believe them. Yet emotional truth lay exposed between both sides. They understood empire braced for change. Her legal influence remained powerful until final months. She strengthened property rights for women newly widowed by plague. She expanded financial protections for orphans and directed imperial funding toward hospitals overwhelmed by survivors suffering long-term infection complications. She encouraged Justinian to maintain compassionate policies even as treasury strained, insisting empire needed moral character more than material wealth. But Theodora's greatest impact during declining health lay in her emotional counsel to Justinian. Plague had carved deep sorrow into emperor, and Theodora became last voice reminding him empire required tenderness, not simply structure. Their late-night conversations are described by court chroniclers as profound, discussing meaning of rule, fragility of human life, future of Christianity, and continuity of Byzantine identity beyond individuals. She reminded Justinian greatness did not rest solely in conquest or architecture, but in laws shaping common life. She emphasized healing over domination. These final conversations shaped Emperor's final decade significantly. As Theodora weakened, palace atmosphere changed. Ministers whispered carefully around one another. Eunuchs who served her wept quietly during night shifts. Even guards outside her chamber walked with softened steps, understanding hallway sound could wake Empress struggling to sleep through pain. The city outside palace sensed shift too. Sermons across churches asked believers to pray for Empress recovery. Letters arrived from bishops around empire offering blessings. But prayers could not stop time. Her final days occurred under quiet reverence. Sources report Justinian remained beside her continually, reading scripture passages aloud, offering water to her lips, and holding her hands as tremors shook her body. When Theodora died, empire shook emotionally. Bells rang throughout Constantinople. Markets closed, public worship swelled. People remembered her not as actress nor scandalous figure enemies once mocked, but as savior of their dignity, champion of women, protector of poor, and moral anchor preventing emperor from drifting into tyranny. Her death changed Justinian profoundly. He lost voice that balanced his nature. Without her, leadership became heavier, lonelier, harder. Theodora's final legacy was not only law or charity. It was emotional character of empire itself. She taught Constantinople survivors of fire and plague that strength includes compassion, and that power means responsibility toward weakest citizens. After Theodora's death, Constantinople entered psychological transformation unlike any prior moment. Buildings still stood strong. Economy showed signs of rebirth. Plague had waned, but people felt emptiness as though foundational spirit departed. When Hagia Sophia's vast dome echoed funeral hymns dedicated to Theodora, thousands wept not only for woman herself, but for memory of era she represented. She symbolized city's rebirth after fire, moral guidance during riots, and compassionate leadership through plague. Her absence forced Constantinople to confront unfamiliar question. Who were they without her? Despite grief, political system continued functioning. Justinian maintained authority, but courts shifted dynamic. Ministers who once answered to both emperor and empress now answered only to emperor. This created subtle vacuum of moderation. Theodora had buffered Justinian's harsher impulses. Now advisors feared stricter governance. In early months after her death, Justinian indeed pursued more controlling policies. He tightened state supervision over monasteries, fearing heretical influence. He increased censorship on theological writing. He expanded espionage networks, tracking elite correspondence. These actions reflected insecurity more than cruelty. Widowed emperor clung to control because he lost emotional certainty. Yet Justinian was not tyrant. His relationship with empire remained deeply philosophical. He saw Theodora's death as test from God, pushing him to prove faith beyond personal comfort. In speeches, he expressed belief she now interceded for empire in heaven. He referred to her legacy repeatedly, honoring her decisions rather than reversing them. Meanwhile, public identity evolved sharply. Survivors of fire and plague developed new cultural language around grief. Poets composed laments not only about dead empress, but about fragility of life. The city that once celebrated achievement now embraced introspective mourning. Mosaics created after her death showed imagery of angels leading soul toward divine light. Artists painted Theodora not as empress, but as saint-like figure. Her supporters built shrines honoring her charity work. Women across empire felt her loss deeply. They feared legal protections she established might weaken. Yet surprisingly, her reforms persisted. Justinian upheld laws she supported, perhaps out of love, perhaps because he recognized reforms stabilized society. Her influence remained more powerful dead than many rulers alive. Her passing also reshaped gender perception. Young women studied her life story, rising from poverty to throne, and viewed possibility no longer forbidden. Her memory empowered new generation to seek education, speak publicly, and manage trade. Even though Byzantine world still patriarchal, psychological door had opened. The city's daily rhythm also changed after plague and Theodora's death. Before catastrophe, urban soundscape filled with tavern laughter, music, theater voices, markets, and children running. After plague, laughter softened. After Theodora, laughter slowed again. Streets felt quieter at night. Lantern light flickered through narrower crowds. The Hippodrome, once roaring arena of massive energy, saw reduced attendance. But silence did not mean decay. It meant reflection. The empire shifted from spectacle culture toward study culture. Academy enrollment increased. Students preferred theology, medicine, philosophy, and mathematics over entertainment. Parents encouraged scholar identity because war, disease, and famine taught value of intellect. Meanwhile, architectural development continued, though on smaller scale. Justinian sponsored new bathhouses, aqueduct repairs, and church expansions. But buildings now symbolize stability rather than ambition. After two crises, empire no longer needed to prove greatness through structures. It needed to preserve daily life. Religious worldview transformed as well. Before fire, people believed God made empire invincible. After fire, they believed God rewarded resilience. After plague, they realized survival itself proved divine mercy. After Theodora's death, faith evolved again. God not only tested empire, God guided by taking beloved figures whose absence forced renewal. This theological maturity leaked into society. People accepted tragedy with deeper philosophical calm. But beneath philosophical reflection simmered unresolved tension. Many feared Justinian, without Theodora, might drift into dangerous isolation. Others believed he would channel grief into new creativity. Time would soon reveal truth. Justinian's final decade brought a mixture of brilliance and exhaustion. As Constantinople adapted to life after Theodora, identity of empire underwent profound reimagining. Earlier Byzantine self-image drew from Roman pride. Belief empire destined to conquer world, revive ancient glory, and restore universal empire. But now, after plague, after loss, after economic difficulty, society embraced different question. What if strength meant preservation rather than expansion? This shift became ideological revolution. Citizens, freed from earlier triumphalist narrative, began valuing stability, peace, welfare, law, learning, and community more deeply. Public inscriptions praised ordinary workers, not generals. Street poets glorified resilience, not conquest. Children raised after plague admired scholars more than warriors. This change made sense historically. Rome collapsed partly from overextension. Byzantium learned caution. Justinian, though ambitious intellectually, realized empire no longer possessed energy or population to wage endless war. As a result, he negotiated peace with Persia, expensive but necessary treaty. This decision allowed empire to redirect funds toward urban recovery rather than battlefield supply. Economically, post-Theodora years focused on rebuilding professional networks. Former plague refugees returned to city, re-establishing workshops in carpentry, leatherwork, pottery, textiles, and iron forging. Bread ovens reopened, markets buzzed again, fishing fleet expanded. Though economy did not match pre-plague peak, it regained momentum. Education flourished richly. Monasteries transformed into quiet universities teaching scripture, grammar, history, and medicine. Children who survived plague grew into generation psychologically shaped by trauma and rebirth. Disciplined, contemplative, determined to prevent ignorance. They asked questions earlier generations avoided. Why did plague arrive? Why do empires fall? Why do humans fear death? Their essays filled school papyri with deep philosophical speculation. Urban architecture changed identity too. Pre-fire city architecture glorified empire's dominance. Post-fire rebuilding used stone to resist flames. Post-plague rebuilding emphasized air, light, and movement. Homes included more windows. Streets featured plazas for community gathering. Fountains multiplied to promote hygiene. Constantinople slowly evolved into a healthier city environment, not because rulers understood infection scientifically, but because survival taught practical lessons. Meanwhile, spirituality softened. Citizens previously obsessed with doctrinal purity now valued ethical living, feeding poor, forgiving neighbors, honoring dead. Churches strengthened charity networks, distributing bread daily to needy. Wealthy merchant families donated their fortunes to hospitals. Spiritual leadership shifted from ideological conflict toward pastoral care. Yet beneath surface calm, another transformation took shape. New intellectual attitude toward empire history. Scholars reviewed chronicles of fire, riots, plague, war, and rebuilding, and concluded Byzantine world followed cycles. Catastrophe, reconstruction, creation. They argued destruction served as catalyst for innovation. This belief generated sense of destiny different from earlier Roman destiny. Not grand conquest, but eternal endurance. Furthermore, citizens began identifying themselves not simply as Romans or Greeks, but specifically as Byzantines. People shaped by a mixture of cultures, religions, languages, and experiences. The empire developed stronger, unique identity, distinguished from classical Rome. That identity emerged precisely because trauma forced linguistic, cultural, and ideological blending. In palace corridors, however, another shift occurred. Power began centralizing more intensely around emperor as old aristocracy faded. Since plague erased many noble bloodlines, bureaucrats replaced hereditary elites as governing class. This changed imperial politics forever. Empire leadership rested on education, not ancestry. And yet, empire remained vulnerable. Plague destroyed half population. Economy required decades to reach previous strength. Provinces outside Constantinople experienced slower recovery. Italy war exhausted treasury. But despite vulnerability, resilience defined era. Citizens continued repairing aqueducts, restoring art studios, rebuilding libraries, renovating homes, planting vineyards, re-establishing trade ports, and teaching children. Constantinople learned ultimate lesson. Empires do not survive because they avoid disaster. Empires survive because they adapt to disaster. And thus, post-Theodora Byzantium entered new world. Less glamorous, less arrogant, but wiser, deeper, spiritually richer, and psychologically prepared for future challenges. Then first bodies appeared. At beginning, only a few people died. Dock loaders, merchants, travelers. Their deaths stirred little public fear. People assumed victims suffered from ordinary fever. But soon numbers increased rapidly. Peddlers collapsed in streets. Bakers died beside ovens. Soldiers fainted at barracks gates. Families reported swelling erupting under armpits and groin. Buboes that burst and filled homes with stench. Panic erupted. Rumors spread faster than plague itself. Some claimed demons punished city for arrogance built through Hagia Sophia's grandeur. Others insisted stars had shifted in sky as omen. Astrologers received overwhelming requests for interpretation. Citizens begged priests to explain tragedy. Government attempted rational response. Justinian ordered quarantine of infected houses. He sent physicians to study victims and write recommendations. But knowledge lagged. Cures were primitive. Doctors applied leeches to buboes, bled patients believing illness needed release, burned herbs hoping to cleanse air. None worked. When plague entered palace walls, fear escalated further. Servants died in clusters. Eunuchs who guarded imperial chambers collapsed within days. Even Justinian himself contracted illness. His fever raged. Swelling distorted his face. For days, empire believed emperor would die. Some already whispered plans for succession. Yet Justinian survived, though weakened. Upon recovery, he viewed plague as divine punishment and divine warning. He questioned whether God sent disease to humble empire after pride of conquest. He wondered if rebuilding city physically without rebuilding soul spiritually called wrath. Meanwhile, Constantinople drowned in grief. Corpses filled streets faster than burial teams could respond. Families could not dig graves quickly enough. Bodies piled outside city gates. Dogs tore flesh from unburied dead. Priests performed mass funerals with thousands gathered silently weeping. Markets shut down. Ships ceased arrival. Trade collapsed. Hunger gripped lower classes. People locked themselves indoors. Silence replaced music and street laughter. This plague would forever reshape empire identity, turning triumph into terror, power into vulnerability, hope into existential fear. Memory of great fire had taught Constantinople disaster could come from flame. Plague taught disaster could come from breath. The emotional shock of plague rivaled trauma of the Great Fire. Whereas fire destroyed buildings, plague destroyed bodies. One catastrophe reshaped cities' external form, the other its internal human content. Citizens who once felt united by survival now face crisis without visible enemy. Flames could be fought with water. Riots could be crushed by soldiers. But disease struck silently, without mercy, choosing victims randomly. This randomness shattered sense of divine protection. Survivors questioned spiritual interpretation. Before plague, people believed Hagia Sophia guaranteed safety. They believed city stood above divine punishment because emperor ruled with God's blessing. Yet plague shredded this illusion. Bishops struggled to explain why pious children died while corrupt merchants lived. Why monks died chanting in churches. Why even holy relics and icons failed to shield faithful. Some believers clung to faith even harder, attending prayer processions through city streets. They carried crosses, sang hymns, held relics of saints, and sprinkled holy water across markets. But gathering crowds worsened contagion. More died. Religious processions became death routes. Theodora pleaded with clergy to reduce gatherings. Justinian issued decrees limiting public ceremony. But faith often outruns law. People desperate to survive reached for miracle rather than logic. Desperation altered social behavior. Friends refused to help sick neighbors for fear of infection. Parents abandoned dying children in alleyways. Husbands fled from infected wives. Priests refused house visits except under extreme protection. City spirit broke apart piece by piece. Civil order collapsed. Many businesses closed. Prices skyrocketed. Grain became scarce. Charcoal sellers raised prices while temperature plummeted. Bakers refused service fearing disease from customers. Funeral workers died faster than replaced. Government recruited laborers to handle corpses, paying extra coin, but most refused job. Some criminals offered services hoping to earn freedom through corpse removal. Mass graves replaced individual burials. Entire family plots filled with nameless bodies. Churches lost burial records. Names erased from history. Psychology changed dramatically. Survivors exhibited emotional numbness, staring blankly at city skyline, unable to cry, unable to speak. Others experienced uncontrollable grief, screaming inside ruined courtyards. Some hallucinated last conversations with lost family. Rumors of apocalypse spread. Astrologers predicted end of world. People sold property for worthless coins, believing wealth useless if death inevitable. Marriages dissolved. Engagements canceled. Children orphaned everywhere. Artistic life vanished overnight. Theater closed. Poetry ceased. Musicians lost audiences. Scholars died before finishing manuscripts. city that once sang now echoed only with funeral bells. Yet deeper transformation unfolded. Plague attacked moral beliefs. Citizens previously convinced of divine favoritism now questioned everything. Many realized Hagia Sophia, for all its beauty, could not fend off nature's force. Some lost faith entirely, turning cynical. Others strengthened belief, arguing plague separated faithful from hypocrites. And that brings us to the end of today's powerful historical journey. We witnessed Constantinople rise from fire, rebuild through faith, suffer through plague, and reinvent itself under pressure. Today, you learned how riots nearly collapsed the empire, how Justinian rebuilt a world city from ashes, how Theodora shaped law, society, women's rights, and imperial morality, how bureaucrats, scholars, soldiers, and artists reshaped Byzantine identity, and how plague changed the soul of a civilization forever. The moral of this story? Empires do not survive because they never fall. They survive because people stand back up. Constantinople teaches us no disaster is final. No trauma is wasted. Rebirth always hides inside destruction. And history repeats. Humanity today still faces fire. We still face disease. We still rebuild after loss. We still search for meaning. If you enjoyed this deep historical journey, remember, History Teller YT is only beginning. More empires are waiting. More legends are hidden. More voices from the past are ready to speak. So subscribe, return tomorrow, and continue exploring the world with us. Because here at History Channel, we don't just tell history, we make you feel it. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story. Monks retreated to monasteries, hoping isolation protected them spiritually and physically. Some monastic communities experienced complete death. Entire buildings emptied. Bells rang without ringers, relics guarded by silence. Even the empire's legal system paused. Courts shut down. Trials delayed. Legal petitions unanswered. Government could not function properly. Tax collection stopped. Imperial treasury starved. Foreign perception shifted. Persia saw opportunity. Italian rebels regrouped. Enemies believed empire dying under weight of disease. Scholars would later call plague greatest turning point in Justinian's reign. Not fire, not war, but disease. Because fire destroyed structures, but plague destroyed societal fabric. Fire united people against shared tragedy. Plague isolated them through fear. Still, humanity persisted. Some risked lives to nurse strangers, proving compassion remained alive. Women formed neighborhood care circles delivering bread and water to infected houses. Priests comforted dying when doctors fled. Youth dug graves for parents. Heroism emerged quietly. This era demonstrated dual human truth. Greatest suffering reveals greatest cruelty and greatest kindness simultaneously. As plague spread through Constantinople, leadership required not only policy, but deep moral judgment. Justinian fait impossible décision. Should he restrict trade entirely and starve city to reduce infection? Or allow trade and risk further spread? Should he order forced quarantine, violating civil rights? Or trust citizens to act responsibly even under panic? These choices reflect earliest form of public health policy, not through science, but through moral reasoning. Initially, Justinian attempted rational containment. He restricted gatherings, ordered inspection of ports, demanded corpse removal, and offered financial support to families of burial workers. He commanded engineers to burn infected clothing and bedding. He created emergency labor units to dig mass graves beyond city walls. But scale overwhelmed logic. Death numbers rose faster than laws could adapt. Even emperor admitted defeat in letters to provincial governors. No plan succeeds against breath of God. Justinian's personal illness made crisis more emotional. Citizens saw Emperor himself vulnerable. If God allowed ruler to suffer, what hope remained for common man? His survival offered symbolic reassurance, yet also raised theological confusion. Some believed Emperor lived because chosen. Others believed plague spared him because incomplete destiny awaited. Theodora played a vital role keeping empire functional. She oversaw palace organization, managed food distribution, and commanded court officials to protect widows from property theft. Her voice calmed frightened ministers. She ordered clergy to provide comfort, but avoid unsafe mass gatherings. Meanwhile, government faced economic collapse. Trade routes shut down. African grain shipment frequency declined. Italy war funding halted. Soldiers awaiting salary grew restless. Tax revenue vanished. Government began melting church gold to pay emergency costs. The city's morale reached lowest point since riots. For first time since Reconstruction began, people wondered if rebuilding meant nothing. Fire survivors whispered if disaster followed disaster, because empire offended heaven. Religious interpretation intensified. Some priests preached suffering purified soul. Others declared plague punishment for pride. Some argued it tested faith, not judged it. Others blamed heretics, Jews, pagans, astrologers, or foreigners. Scapegoating erupted violently. Foreigners attacked. Jewish communities faced accusations with no evidence. Government deployed soldiers to protect minorities, but suspicion lingered. Urban design also revealed weakness. Despite wider streets and improved water systems, dense population accelerated infection. Constantinople's strength, its size, became fatal weakness. Doctors tried treatments based on humoral theory. They prescribed bed rest, diet changes, aromatherapy, and herbal mixtures. None helped. Plague inflicted long-term demographic change. Children died in terrifying numbers, leaving fewer future workers. Elderly died, losing cultural memory. Scholars died, silencing knowledge. Skilled artisans died, weakening trade guilds. Economy suffered drastically. Shops closed permanently. Landlords lost tenants. Farmers lost markets. Yet, amidst despair, rebuilding memory of fire provided psychological anchor. Survivors recalled how world once ended through flames, and yet city survived. They clung to idea plague too would pass, and Constantinople would rise again. Public writing during plague demonstrates powerful philosophical shift. Historians described humanity as fragile dust shaped by divine wind. They questioned meaning of empire. They wrote, "What is marble against breath? What is law against sickness?" Empire identity transformed from pride to humility. When plague finally decreased after waves of death, Constantinople emerged smaller, quieter, poorer, but wiser. Citizens who survived walked streets differently, seeing beauty not as entitlement, but as miracle. The Great Fire had rebuilt cities' physical identity. Plague rebuilt cities' spiritual identity. Where fire taught strength through unity, plague taught strength through endurance. As the initial waves of the plague finally weakened, Constantinople emerged in a strange silence. Not the silence of fear, but the silence following overwhelming grief. Entire neighborhoods stood hollow. Doors hung open to houses whose occupants no longer breathed. Streets that once overflowed with merchants and artisans now felt stretched and empty. Bells rang not for celebration, but to mark final burials. Even the waves beating against the harbor walls seemed quieter, as if city itself paused to inhale after drowning. The survivors who remained faced a different world than the one destroyed by disease. Reconstruction after the Great Fire had been an act of visible creation. Building stone, raising domes, shaping streets. But the aftermath of plague demanded invisible rebuilding, psychological, demographic, and spiritual renewal. Every citizen found themselves surrounded by absence. Families lost parents, siblings, spouses, and children. Guild workshops once filled with hammer noise now echoed, as though the tools themselves mourned their missing owners. Schools reopened with half their students gone. The empire had to rebuild, not architecture this time, but population. Justinian, weakened physically but strengthened internally, understood recovery required not just mourning, but movement. He ordered census revisions to measure losses. Government clerks traveled district to district recording names of survivors. These lists revealed shocking truth. Citizenship numbers had dropped by nearly half. Skilled workers vanished, leaving guilds crippled. Aristocratic lineages disappeared entirely. Monasteries which once housed vibrant communities stood silent, their halls empty, their libraries untouched by human hands. In response, Justinian enacted new population policies. He encouraged immigration from rural provinces into Constantinople with promises of tax benefits, land distribution, and food access. People from Anatolia, Armenia, Syria, and Thrace arrived cautiously, drawn by opportunity. Slowly, the empty spaces of city refilled, though not with same original families. Constantinople became younger, more diverse, and less aristocratic. Trauma erased lineage advantage. Rebirth offered equal ground. Economically, plague forced reinvention. Before disease, war financing and monumental architecture drove wealth movement. After plague, empire turned inward. Urban markets reopened with new structure. Meat sellers, grain traders, pottery makers, and metalworkers reorganized guild authority. Surviving master craftsmen trained new apprentices rapidly to replace dead workers. This urgent training reshaped guild culture. Tradition loosened, innovation increased. Old techniques merged with new ideas brought by immigrants. Trade networks shifted dramatically, with Italian wars slowing and African grain shipments unpredictable. Constantinople prioritized Eastern Mediterranean commerce. Silk caravans brought fabric from Asia. Merchants turned toward Black Sea for timber and fish. This change permanently altered empire economy. Trade expanded across different borders, diversifying wealth flow. Urban planning revived too. City officials used plague, depopulation as opportunity to improve design. Some abandoned districts were demolished entirely and rebuilt with better sanitation. Wider streets reduced fire risk. Housing blocks reorganized to allow air circulation. Aware disease spread through proximity. Authorities imposed new spatial regulation on architecture. Although unaware of bacteria, they recognized importance of airflow, cleanliness, and household spacing. Health consciousness entered urban planning, marking evolution from fire-era rebuilding to plague-era restructuring. Culturally, city moved through intense mourning tradition. Families wrote names of dead relatives into prayer scrolls placed inside Hagia Sophia. Monks composed hymns honoring plague victims. Priests preached sermons acknowledging suffering but encouraging resilience. New rituals emerged in public memory, lighting candles at sunset, ringing small bells for lost children, singing laments written by poets who survived mourning alone. But renewal was not only sorrow. As mortality shrank population, economic opportunity grew for surviving families. Land once owned by large aristocratic houses transferred into new hands. Wealth redistribution created unexpected social mobility. Some working-class families ascended into merchant power. Certain women who survived their husbands inherited households, becoming influential community leaders. Thus, the aftermath of plague produced paradox. Immense loss, but massive transformation. The city emerged not weaker, but different, leaner, more pragmatic, more diverse, and more driven by collective memory than inherited hierarchy. Constantinople never forgot plague. Every building constructed afterwards carried memory of empty streets. Every song, every poem, every law echoed loss. Social dynamics in post-plague Constantinople grew complicated. Trauma reshaped interpersonal behavior. Many citizens experienced survivors' guilt. They questioned why they lived while others died. Some avoided joy because laughter felt betrayal. Others clung to life fiercely, eager to rebuild everything lost. Weddings increased dramatically as survivors sought stability through family formation. Birth rates rose, revealing biological instinct following catastrophe. Life racing to fill void left by death. Children who lost parents entered new guardianship policies. Justinian's courts expanded orphan protection programs. Elderly women served as caretakers. Monasteries opened dormitories. Wealthy households adopted orphans. Some became apprentices, learning crafts, art, literature, metalworking, carpentry, medicine, and navigation. This foster care system unintentionally created new educated class. Orphan boys trained in administration later became government clerks, while orphan girls joined convents or households with literacy skills rare before plague. Transformation rooted in necessity bloomed into long-term intellectual enrichment. Religious interpretation also changed. After the Great Fire, Christianity had been identity of pride, God rebuilding the city through imperial grace. After plague, Christianity transformed into religion of humility, God testing humanity through suffering. Sermons shifted from triumphal themes to existential ones. Priests preached forgiveness, compassion, acceptance, and charity. Theological debate about divine punishment lost intensity. Instead, preachers emphasized mercy. Mysticism gained ground. Citizens sought meaning through dreams, visions, spiritual symbols. Some monks spoke of hearing voices during plague. People believed angels guided survivors. Many families built private shrines in homes, praying every morning before work. This domestic spirituality marked new religious shift. Worship became internal rather than strictly communal. Artistic revival emerged too, though not in celebratory tone witnessed after fire. Plague-era art expressed sorrow, silence, contemplation. Mosaicists depicted saints comforting grieving children. Painters illustrated broken architecture merging into tree growth, symbolizing rebirth through decay. Poets embraced darker metaphors. Moonlight on empty streets, wind carrying whispers of dead souls, time melting into memory. These artistic changes reflect psychological truth. Trauma reshapes creativity into reflection rather than praise. Literacy increased further. With so many scribes dead, writing became urgent skills citizens wanted to learn. Schools filled with students who read scripture not only to worship, but to search comfort in stories. Texts from Job and Psalms became especially popular. Medical books copied rapidly. Scholars desperate to find biological understanding behind plague, studying anatomy, herbal compounds, and ancient Greek medical theory. Economic philosophy also transformed. Citizens began saving money rather than spending on luxuries. They understood how wealth protected against hunger. People invested in grain storage, livestock, and farmland. Market prices fluctuated. Famine remained constant threat. Poverty statistics became harsh measurement of survival. Crime increased for short period. Orphans without support turned to theft. Deserters attacked merchants, and starving families raided storehouses. Government responded with justice programs. offering criminals chance to become laborers instead of prisoners. This policy reduced crime while rebuilding economy. Yet community compassion surpassed criminality. Many wealthy citizens donated land to poor families. Priests distributed bread freely. Women formed guilds to produce blankets for widows. Survivors considered each other equals. Because plague erased class arrogance, death had proven all bodies fragile, regardless of wealth. Urban identity changed. Before plague, city held confidence of eternal empire. After plague, humility defined personality of Constantinople. Citizens spoke more gently, listened more patiently, respected suffering more deeply. Philosophers identified new moral virtues: solidarity, gratitude, and impermanence. Teachers told students, fire rebuilt our walls. Plague rebuilt our hearts. Theodora's declining health added emotional weight. She saw plague not only as disaster, but opportunity to deepen compassion. Her laws protecting women expanded further. She established new homes for widows whose husbands died in plague and sponsored medical research institutions. Her empathy shaped generation of moral leadership. But even as life slowly regenerated, fear lingered. Survivors wondered, would plague return? Would next generation face same horror? How vulnerable did empire remain? These questions shaped every decision, from architecture to trade, from law to theology. Constantinople lived in constant negotiation between hope and caution. While social behavior adapted to post-plague environment, political reality faced tumultuous challenges. Justinian, though extremely resilient, now confronted empire that no longer matched earlier dreams. Before plague, his life mission centered on expansion, reclaiming Roman territories, building glorious monuments, and creating unified Christianity. After plague, his mission shifted toward preservation, protecting what remained, securing borders, and ensuring social peace. Military structure suffered immense losses. Armies in Italy, Syria, and Africa felt weakened by plague death toll. Veterans died far from home, leaving regiments under strength. Recruitment declined because population dropped. War strategy changed accordingly. Rather than large-scale conquest, Justinian focused on holding existing positions. Italian campaign slowed. African territories required emergency reinforcement. Persian diplomats sensed weakness and increased political pressure. Bureaucracy faced collapse. Thousands of scribes, accountants, archivists, and judges perished. Government lost ability to process legal cases efficiently. Imperial court tried to solve crisis by accelerating education for young scholars, granting them early positions. This created an entire generation of officials who rose to power unusually young. Their fresh ideas modernized administrative procedure, but also clashed with older conservative expectations. Economic taxation required complete redesign. Demand for revenue crashed because population shrank. Justinian reduced taxes on some rural provinces to encourage farming. He also removed import fees temporarily to revive trade. Treasury accepted debt, something unthinkable before plague. Empire leadership recognized that controlling economy required flexibility, not rigidity. Political alliances shifted. With domestic workforce depleted, Justinian invited foreign craftsmen, physicians, and merchants in a city to fill roles. This multicultural influx shaped imperial worldview. Constantinople learned to rely on global knowledge rather than isolation. Persian physicians treated plague survivors. Egyptian architects built restored public baths. Syrian merchants reopened spice routes. Opposition arose from xenophobic voices. Some argued foreigners stole jobs and changed culture. But empire needed workforce, and Justinian defended immigration policies publicly. Religion also altered political power. Patriarchs gained moral authority because citizens turned to spiritual explanations. Church influence on legal matters expanded. Monastic leaders advised government decisions. While this increased unity, it also sparked debate between secular administrators and clerical thinkers over policy direction. Meanwhile, Justinian struggled emotionally with diminished empire strength. His writings suggest disappointment yet acceptance. He realized dream of fully restored Roman world no longer possible, but he also recognized new mission, save what remained. Government propaganda changed tone. Before plague, public inscriptions celebrated victory. After plague, they celebrated survival. Hagia Sophia's sermons highlighted gratitude rather than triumph. Imperial speeches honored dead workers who rebuilt city rather than praising emperor alone. This humility made leadership more human. Culturally, something profound occurred. Constantinople embraced fragility as identity. Fire taught courage, plague taught vulnerability. Together, they produced civilization more complete than either alone. Historians later argued Justinian's greatest success was not conquest or architecture, but enduring plague without empire collapse. Had political foundation been weaker, Byzantine Empire might have fallen centuries earlier. But Constantinople was not finished changing. Though plague retreated temporarily, its shadow lingered. It altered gene pools, economic systems, migration patterns, and cultural attitudes. It even changed architecture. Future buildings included larger windows for airflow, more fountains for hygiene, and additional storage for emergency resources.